I am Lauren, 34 years old, and right now I am sitting in a cheap motel with a dead husband and a pending wire transfer for $50 million that might either save my life or land me in a federal penitentiary. Just 36 hours ago, my husband Harrison leaned across our dinner table, gripped my wrist until it bruised, and told me to transfer his entire fortune immediately because his own son and daughter-in-law were trying to destroy him. Then he dropped dead, and before his body was even cold, they showed up at the hospital with a lawyer and an eviction notice accusing me of murder and thievery. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to rewrite your story. The nightmare began on an ordinary Thursday evening. Harrison and I were sitting in the private dining room of our home, an estate located in the historic Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. Outside, a classic New England storm was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, throwing sheets of icy rain against the glass. Harrison had spent the last 20 years building a global tech logistics empire, a company that processed millions of international shipments a day. He was 58, full of life, and the most brilliant man I had ever known. But tonight he looked exhausted. His skin carried a strange gray pallor that sent an immediate chill down my spine. I was serving the steak when his knife suddenly clattered against the fine bone china. I looked up, alarmed. Harrison was gripping his chest, his breathing heavy and shallow. "Harrison, what is wrong?" "Let me call 911, I urged, already reaching into my pocket for my phone. He lunged across the table and grabbed my wrist. His grip was terrifyingly weak, his palms clammy and cold. "No time, Lauren." He gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled for air. "Listen to me very carefully. Open my encrypted drive. Transfer the entire $50 million from the Alpha Fund to your hidden offshore account. Do it right now, Lauren, just to be safe. Don't let Jackson or Naomi find out, especially Naomi. They have been—" Harrison collapsed onto the dark hardwood floor before he could finish the sentence. Panic seized me. I dropped to my knees beside him, screaming his name, my hands frantically pressing against his chest to start CPR. I managed to call emergency services, my voice shaking as I gave our address to the dispatcher. While the sirens wailed in the distance, I looked back at the dining table. Harrison's laptop was open. The bypass codes for the hidden Alpha Fund were written on a crumpled piece of paper beside his plate. As a former forensic accountant, I had spent the first 10 years of my career hunting down corporate thieves, tracing hidden assets, and unraveling complex financial scams for major firms in Chicago. I knew Harrison's corporate ledgers inside and out. There was no Alpha Fund on his public books. $50 million in liquid cash did not just sit around unnoticed unless it was being hidden intentionally. But looking at my husband's pale, unmoving face on the floor, I didn't care about the legality. I cared about his survival. I opened the laptop, entered the encrypted bypass keys, and initiated the transfer to my private account. Because it was an international wire of an astronomical sum, the banking protocol triggered an automatic security hold. The screen flashed, "Transfer pending, final clearance in 48 hours." The paramedics arrived, bursting through the front doors, and rushed Harrison to the hospital. The next 36 hours became a blur of sterile waiting rooms, the smell of clinical antiseptic, and pure, suffocating grief. Harrison never regained consciousness. He lay in the intensive care unit, hooked up to a dozen tubes and monitors, his heart fading with every passing hour. I sat beside his bed, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face in the dim room as I checked the wire status over and over again. The banking app displayed the same message: "Transfer pending. Clearance in 12 hours." I reached out, wrapping my cold fingers around his hand. "I did it, Harrison," I whispered into the quiet room, tears spilling over my eyelashes. "The money is moving. It is pending. Just please hold on. You have to wake up." When Harrison and I married 2 years ago, the Boston high society circles tore me apart. They called me a gold digger, a trophy wife, who had targeted an older wealthy man. I was 34, and Harrison was 24 years my senior. His son Jackson, who was only 3 years younger than me, had completely boycotted our wedding, refusing to even look at me. Jackson's wife Naomi, an incredibly sharp and ambitious African-American woman, had climbed the corporate ladder to become the chief financial officer of Harrison's company. She had attended the wedding, but her smile was cold and calculated. They both viewed me as a threat to their inheritance, an outsider who had disrupted their ready-made empire. They had no idea that I had been making a successful six-figure salary as a forensic auditor before retiring early to support Harrison after his first minor stroke. I did not need his money. I just wanted a peaceful life with the man I loved. But as I sat by his hospital bed, the monitors suddenly began to scream. A sharp, high-pitched, unbroken tone filled the ICU room, shattering the silence. The green line on the cardiac screen went completely flat. Code blue. "We need a crash cart in Bay 4 immediately," a nurse shouted, slamming the door open. Medical staff swarmed the bed, throwing me backward against the cold plaster wall. I watched in a paralyzed horror as they charged the defibrillator paddles, their voices a chaotic mix of emergency commands. Clear. Harrison's body violently jolted upward. Clear. The paddles hit his chest again. Nothing happened. The flat line remained. Time of death, 11:42 p.m. The attending physician announced softly, dropping his hands. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with professional pity. "I am so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Williams." The room began to spin. The man who had been my anchor, my protector, was gone. I sank into the chair, my mind completely numb, until my eyes landed on my laptop sitting on the rolling medical tray. The screen was still glowing. Transfer pending. Clearance in 10 hours. Harrison's final, truest words echoed in my mind with sudden, terrifying clarity. "Don't let Jackson or Naomi find out, especially Naomi." I snapped my laptop shut and slid it into my bag just as the door to the waiting room burst open. It had been exactly 3 hours since Harrison took his last breath. I was sitting in the private family waiting room at the end of the intensive care unit corridor. I had not changed clothes. My beige blouse was severely wrinkled, bearing a faint rust-colored smudge of Harrison's blood from when I had desperately tried to perform chest compressions at the house. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. I was staring blankly at the ugly floral pattern of the hospital carpet, trying to process the absolute collapse of my entire world. The heavy oak doors of the waiting room pushed open with a violent thud. Jackson strode in first. He was wearing a tailored navy suit with not a single hair out of place. There was no redness in his eyes and no tremble in his lip. He looked like he was walking into a hostile corporate board meeting rather than the hospital ward where his father had just passed away. Right behind him was Naomi. She was immaculate in a sharp charcoal blazer, her posture rigid and commanding. As a fiercely intelligent African-American woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry, she was entirely used to dominating every room she entered. As the chief financial officer of Harrison's logistics empire, she wielded her power with ruthless efficiency. She carried a sleek leather briefcase, her heels clicking ominously against the linoleum floor. Trailing them was a man I recognized immediately. Bradley. He was a notorious probate lawyer in Boston, known for gutting estates and leaving widows with pennies on the dollar. "Jackson," I whispered, standing up as my voice cracked with sheer exhaustion. "I am so sorry. He is gone." Jackson did not offer a hug. He did not even offer a basic word of comfort. He stopped 2 feet away from me, his jaw set hard. "Where is the laptop, Lauren?" I froze. The heavy grief that had been suffocating me was suddenly pierced by a sharp spike of adrenaline. "What? Do not play dumb with me," Jackson sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing register. "The company laptop, the one he kept in the private study. Where is it? Your father just died 3 hours ago." "Jackson, he has not even been moved to the morgue yet, and you are asking me about a computer." Naomi stepped forward smoothly, interposing herself between me and her husband. Her expression was utterly devoid of empathy. It was a mask of cold, calculating authority. Lauren, let us not make this difficult, Naomi said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. Harrison was a sick man. His mental faculties were clearly declining over the past few weeks. As CFO, I noticed several unauthorized, highly irregular transaction requests originating from his private terminal. We are here to secure company assets. He had a stroke, Naomi. Not dementia, I fired back. My shock rapidly transmuted into fierce defensive anger. His mind was perfectly sharp right until the end. And since when does a chief financial officer bring a probate shark to a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning? I shot a glare at Bradley, who simply adjusted his silk tie with a smug, knowing smile. Since the moment we realized you were taking advantage of a dying man, Jackson snapped. He took a step closer, towering over me. You think we did not know we tracked the IP pings? We know a wire transfer was initiated tonight. $50 million, Lauren. $50 million. You really thought you could gut my father's estate while he was literally drawing his last breath? My blood ran completely cold. They knew about the transfer, but how Harrison had used a heavily encrypted ghost server. Unless Naomi had keyloggers installed on the company internal network. As CFO, she had the security clearance to monitor backdoor financial channels. My forensic accountant instincts flared to life. She had been illegally monitoring his private movements. That transfer was initiated by Harrison, not me, I said, keeping my voice dead level. I refused to let them see me shake. He knew exactly what he was doing. Oh, please, Naomi laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the sterile walls. She unclasped her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She tossed them onto the glass coffee table between us. You are 34 years old. You have not worked a real job in 5 years. You spent your days redecorating the mansion and attending charity galas on my father-in-law's dime. You think any judge in the state of Massachusetts is going to believe that a corporate titan voluntarily wired $50 million to a hidden account just hours before he dropped dead? She leaned in, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute venom. It is textbook undue influence, Lauren. Financial elder abuse. Elder abuse. I gasped, stepping back as if she had physically struck me in the face. I loved him. I took care of him. When he had his first stroke last year, where were you two? You were skiing in the Swiss Alps, Jackson. I was the one feeding him, rehabilitating him, helping him learn how to walk again. And you were compensated quite well for your nursing services, Jackson retorted, his lip curling in utter disgust. You got to live in a $10 million house and play the grand lady of Beacon Hill. But the free ride is over. Cancel the transfer, Lauren. Do it now. The transfer is pending. I said, my forensic training completely overriding my emotional devastation. It clears in less than 12 hours, and I will not touch it. Harrison wanted it moved, and I am honoring his final wish. Bradley, the lawyer, finally stepped forward. He pulled a single, terrifyingly official-looking document from his inside coat pocket. Mrs. Loren, I highly suggest you reconsider your current stance. This is an emergency ex parte injunction signed by a superior court judge an hour ago. We woke him up specifically for this occasion. It immediately freezes all assets belonging to Harrison's estate. It also completely revokes your access to any marital funds, joint accounts, or company resources until a full probate investigation is concluded. I stared at the thick legal paper. They had already gone to a judge. While I was holding my dying husband's hand and begging him to stay with me, they were actively destroying my legal standing and financial security. You cannot do this, I whispered. It is already done, Naomi said softly. She leaned down, picking up the injunction and pressing it directly against my chest. You are a socially unfit, gold-digging anomaly in this family, Lauren. We tolerated you because Harrison demanded it, but he is dead now. Jackson leaned in so close I could smell the stale black coffee on his breath. Do not send it, Lauren. If that money clears, we will have you arrested for wire fraud by sunrise. Now hand over the keys to the house. The keys. I repeated, my voice hollow. I looked from Jackson to Naomi, then to Bradley, hoping this was some kind of twisted, grief-fueled nightmare. You are kicking me out of my own home. At 3 in the morning, my husband's body is still warm down the hall. It is not your home, Bradley interjected smoothly, using his slick courtroom voice. The Beacon Hill estate was purchased by Harrison prior to your marriage. It is held in a revocable trust of which Jackson is the primary beneficiary. Given the pending allegations of financial elder abuse and the unauthorized $50 million wire attempt, my clients have a fiduciary duty to secure the premises immediately to prevent the destruction of evidence. I have a legal right of survivorship. I shot back, my forensic knowledge flashing to the forefront. You cannot execute a unilateral eviction without a formal 30-day notice, regardless of the trust structure. I know the law, Bradley. Naomi smiled. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the predatory baring of teeth. You know accounting law, Lauren. Not probate litigation. Read the injunction. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the document I was holding. Page 3, paragraph 4. The judge granted an immediate emergency vacate order due to flight risk and potential tampering with estate assets. You have exactly 0 rights right now. I looked down at the document. The bold black text blurred before my eyes, but Naomi was right. A judge had actually signed off on this. They had framed me as a desperate thieving gold digger trying to abscond with $50 million in the middle of the night. Naomi stepped closer, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy meant entirely to mock me. It is truly sad, Lauren. Harrison was vulnerable. His mind was slipping and you took advantage of his condition. Everyone saw how you isolated him after his first stroke. You barred us from visiting. You manipulated his diet and his medications. You engineered this entire scenario to enrich yourself. You know that is a lie. I snapped my fists, clenching at my sides. I was the one nursing him back to health while you and Jackson were busy upgrading your luxury cars and draining his expense accounts. I isolated him because his doctors said your constant demands for money were spiking his blood pressure. Jackson sneered, taking a menacing step toward me. Save your breath. The narrative is already set. We have witness statements from the household staff. They are ready to testify that you verbally abused him and forced him to sign financial proxies. You are going to look like a monster in front of the entire city. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice finally cracking under the immense cruelty of their coordinated attack. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, a purse with my encrypted laptop, and a few credit cards. That sounds like a personal problem, Jackson said, crossing his arms. Maybe call one of those charity friends you loved throwing my father's money at. Hand over the keys, Lauren, and the company credit cards, now. My hands shook violently as I unzipped my purse. I pulled out the heavy brass keys to the home I had shared with Harrison for 5 years. The home where we had painstakingly renovated the kitchen together. The home where he had collapsed just hours ago. I dropped them onto the glass table. They hit with a sharp, heavy clatter that sounded like a prison door locking shut. I pulled out the black corporate credit cards and threw them down as well. You will pay for this, Jackson, I whispered, looking my stepson dead in the eye. Harrison knew. He knew exactly what you two were doing behind his back. That is why he wanted the money moved tonight. Jackson's eye twitched a microscopic break in his arrogant facade. He was a sick, confused old man. He did not know anything. I suggest you leave the premises, Bradley said, checking his expensive watch. Security at the estate has already been notified to deny you entry. If you attempt to access the property, you will be arrested for trespassing. Naomi leaned in, lowering her voice so only I could hear. Listen to me very carefully, little girl. You are completely out of your depth. Cancel the wire transfer. Walk away quietly, and maybe we will not press criminal charges for the theft. But if you try to fight us, I promise you, I will make sure you spend the best years of your youth in a federal penitentiary. I did not say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the family waiting room. The hospital corridors felt miles long. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale hue over the linoleum. I walked out through the automatic sliding doors, into the freezing Boston night. The rain was coming down in sheets, icy and unforgiving. I had no jacket. No car, as the vehicle I drove was registered to the company. I was completely and utterly isolated. I stood under the hospital awning, pulling my phone from my pocket. I opened my banking app. Access denied. Account frozen. I tried my personal savings account, the one I had from before the marriage. Access denied. Account frozen. Naomi had not just frozen the estate, she had aggressively frozen my personal assets under the guise of the ongoing fraud investigation. I was a multimillionaire's widow standing in the rain with exactly $42 in cash in my wallet. I hailed a cheap cab, giving the driver the address of a rundown motel near the airport. It was the only place I could afford for the night. As the cab splashed through the flooded streets, the tears finally came. I wept for Harrison. I wept for the cruel, sudden emptiness of my life. I wept for the sheer indignity of being thrown onto the street like trash. But as the cab pulled into the flickering neon glow of the cheap motel, the tears stopped. I paid the driver, walked into the dingy lobby, and paid for one night. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach. The bedspread was a questionable shade of brown. I locked the deadbolt through the security chain and sat down at the wobbly laminate desk in the corner of the room. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag and flipped it open. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark, damp room. I logged into the secure banking portal via my virtual private network. The transfer screen was still up. $50,340,000. Status is pending. Time to clearance is 10 hours and 14 minutes. Naomi thought she had checkmated me. She thought she was dealing with a trophy wife who only knew how to pick out drapes and plan catering menus. She did not realize that before I became a wife, I was a forensic auditor. I was the woman who had personally dismantled a $300 million Ponzi scheme in Chicago. I dismantled complex financial structures for breakfast. If Harrison wanted this money moved, there was a reason. And if Naomi was willing to forge an emergency injunction in the middle of the night to stop it, there was a massive blood-soaked secret buried in those corporate accounts. "You want a war, Naomi," I whispered to the empty room, my fingers flying across the keyboard to open a terminal window. "Let us see exactly how well you hid your tracks." I did not cancel the transfer. Instead, I began to dig. The wobbly laminate desk groaned under the weight of my forearms as I launched my decryption software. The motel room was freezing. The heating unit in the corner rattled noisily, spitting out lukewarm air that smelled of ozone and dust. I pulled my knees to my chest to retain body heat, my eyes entirely locked on the cascading lines of code scrolling down my monitor. As a forensic accountant, I knew that money never simply vanished. It left a trail, a digital footprint. You just had to know where to look. I started with the routing numbers Harrison had hastily scrawled on that crumpled piece of paper during his final moments. The $50 million transfer was currently sitting in a digital purgatory, waiting for the 48-hour clearance protocol to expire. Naomi and Jackson were confident they had locked me out. They assumed freezing my personal bank accounts and stripping me of my credit cards would paralyze me. They wanted me destitute, panicked, and begging for a settlement. They severely underestimated my endurance. My stomach growled violently, a harsh reminder that I had not eaten since the steak dinner before Harrison collapsed. I glanced at my wallet resting near the mousepad. $42. That was my entire net worth at this exact moment. I left the laptop running its trace protocol and walked down to the motel lobby to use the vending machine. I grabbed a stale protein bar and a bottle of water, paying with a crumpled $5 bill. When I swiped my personal debit card at the lobby coffee dispenser just to test it, the machine flashed a harsh red decline message. Naomi had been incredibly thorough. She had weaponized the legal system overnight, effectively erasing my financial existence. I returned to my room, locking the deadbolt. I tore open the protein bar, chewing mechanically, while I stared at the screen. The Trace program had hit a firewall. The Alpha Fund was not a standard corporate investment account. It was shielded by military-grade encryption, the kind typically used by offshore shell companies to obscure illicit activities. Harrison was a straight-laced logistics CEO. He despised shady financial practices. If his money was wrapped in this kind of digital armor, it meant someone else had built the fortress. Someone with the technical financial expertise to bypass standard audits. Someone exactly like his chief financial officer, Naomi. My phone suddenly vibrated on the desk, shattering the quiet concentration of the room. It was not a text message. It was a barrage of social media alerts. My phone buzzed again, vibrating continuously until it threatened to slide off the edge of the desk. I picked it up, my brow furrowing in confusion. Jackson had just gone live on every major social media platform. I tapped the notification bringing up his video. Jackson sat in the center of the frame looking impeccably groomed but perfectly disheveled enough to sell the image of a grieving son. His eyes were red-rimmed. He had clearly rubbed them to simulate tears. Behind him, the grand fireplace of the Beacon Hill mansion provided a wealthy, sympathetic backdrop. The same mansion I had been evicted from just hours prior. Early this morning, my family suffered an unimaginable tragedy, Jackson said to the camera, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. My father, a man who built a logistics empire from the ground up, passed away suddenly. We are entirely devastated. But our grief has been compounded by a horrific betrayal. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. Jackson looked directly into the lens, his expression hardening into righteous fury. My father's new wife, a woman significantly younger than him, attempted to steal $50 million from our family business while he was literally taking his last breaths in the hospital. We caught her initiating the wire transfer from his private terminal. She took advantage of a sick, vulnerable man. We have immediately secured emergency legal injunctions to freeze all assets and have removed her from the family estate to protect my father's legacy. The authorities are currently investigating her for financial elder abuse. He paused, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Please respect our privacy as we navigate this profound loss and seek justice for my father. The video ended. I sat completely paralyzed for 10 seconds. Below the video, the comment section was an absolute bloodbath. Within minutes, the post had garnered thousands of shares. The local Boston news outlets were already picking up the feed, broadcasting Jackson's accusations across the morning news networks. The public response was merciless. People who had never met me were calling me a sociopath, a gold digger, a murderer. Anonymous accounts demanded my immediate arrest. Former acquaintances from the country club posted comments claiming they always knew I was a fraud. My character was being publicly executed in real time. Jackson and Naomi were controlling the narrative, painting me as a predator to hide their own crimes. They knew that if the public condemned me, the police would scrutinize me even harder, making it impossible for me to defend myself against the impending criminal charges. A sharp ping from my laptop drew my attention away from the toxic wasteland of my phone. The trace protocol had finally broken through the first layer of the firewall. Lines of data flooded the screen, revealing the destination coordinates of the hidden funds. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the digital ledger. The anger coursing through my veins sharpened my focus into a deadly weapon. I did not cry over the vicious comments. I did not panic over the frozen bank accounts. The public smear campaign was nothing but a smokescreen designed to distract me from the truth. I highlighted a specific block of transactions originating from the Alpha Fund. The money had not been sitting stagnant. Millions of dollars had been methodically bled from Harrison's logistics company. Unbelievable. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes scanning the digital ledger with predatory focus. The money had not just been siphoned off in a few large chunks. It had been systematically and meticulously drained through thousands of tiny transactions. This was not a smash-and-grab robbery. This was a highly sophisticated corporate bleeding process designed to evade standard automated banking alerts and internal audit triggers. As a forensic accountant, I recognized the methodology instantly. It was a classic technique known as smurfing, where massive amounts of capital are broken down into seemingly innocuous payments to avoid federal reporting thresholds. Someone had been siphoning off funds under the guise of routine operational expenses for Harrison's logistics company, and that someone had the highest level of administrative clearance. I cracked my knuckles and launched my proprietary tracking software. This was a program I had personally coded during my years working in Chicago, designed specifically to unravel layered financial obfuscation. I typed in the primary routing numbers Harrison had hastily written on that crumpled napkin. The software hummed to life, casting a stark blue light across the dingy motel walls. A progress bar crawled across the screen as the program began mapping the financial network, pinging offshore servers and bypassing superficial security walls. While the software ran its aggressive algorithms, I pulled up the public financial disclosures for Harrison's company. I needed a baseline to compare against the hidden Alpha Fund data. According to the official quarterly report signed by Naomi as chief financial officer, the company was operating at a steady but modest profit margin. Operational costs had reportedly surged over the past 4 years due to international shipping tariffs and supply chain disruptions. It was a perfectly plausible narrative for investors and board members. But looking at the raw data streaming into my hidden terminal, I saw the absolute lie hidden beneath her glossy spreadsheets. The operational costs were not surging due to global tariffs. They were surging because Naomi was paying ghost vendors. The software finally generated a visual map of the routing numbers. A complex spiderweb of interconnected nodes appeared on my screen. I clicked on the first cluster of transactions. Millions of dollars had been routed to a shipping entity registered in Delaware. I ran a cross-check on the corporate registry database. The Delaware company had no physical address, no fleet of trucks, and zero payroll records. It was a shell company, a phantom entity existing solely on paper to generate fake invoices. Naomi had been approving millions in payments to this phantom vendor for non-existent freight services. From there, the money bounced. It moved from Delaware to a holding company in Panama, then fractured into a dozen different accounts in Switzerland, before ultimately consolidating again. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. She was using her position to authorize payments bypass internal audits by utilizing obscure accounting loopholes and essentially robbing her father-in-law blind. But Harrison had caught her. The Alpha Fund was not a slush fund he had created to hide wealth from me or the government. The Alpha Fund was a trap. Harrison must have discovered the embezzlement during his recovery from his first stroke, when he had more time to review the raw operational data away from Naomi's curated presentations. Instead of confronting her immediately and risking her destroying the evidence he had quietly set up the Alpha Fund, he had used his supreme executive override authority to claw back the stolen funds from the offshore accounts and trap them in one centralized, highly encrypted location. The $50 million was the physical proof of her monumental fraud. I needed to follow the final thread. I needed to see exactly whose name was attached to the end of the Panama routing chain. If I was going to destroy Naomi and Jackson, I needed irrefutable proof that they were the ultimate beneficiaries of the stolen wealth. I typed a rapid sequence of command lines deploying a brute force packet sniffer to trace the encrypted handshakes between the Panamanian holding company and the final destination bank. The motel heater rattled violently in the corner, but I did not feel the cold anymore. My entire existence was narrowed down to the blinking cursor on the black screen. "Come on," I muttered under my breath, watching the code unspool. "Give me the name. Show me the final account holder." The screen flashed green. Access granted. The final layer of encryption dissolved, revealing a master trust account registered in the Cayman Islands. I downloaded the trust incorporation documents, my eyes darting across the digital pages. There it was, the smoking gun. The sole beneficiaries of the Cayman Trust were Jackson and Naomi. They had siphoned $50 million from Harrison to build their own hidden empire. They were draining his life's work while smiling in his face at Sunday dinners. Suddenly, a chilling realization washed over me. If Naomi realized Harrison had discovered the fraud, she would have known her entire life was about to implode. Wire fraud of this magnitude carried a 20-year federal prison sentence. She would have lost everything: her wealth, her prestigious career, her freedom. Unless Harrison died before he could report it. My hands began to tremble, but not from fear. It was a cold, calculating rage, the sudden cardiovascular collapse. The fact that Jackson and Naomi were already prepared with a high-powered probate lawyer and emergency injunctions just 3 hours after his death. They had orchestrated this. They had framed me for elder abuse to ensure I was completely discredited and removed from the property, preventing me from ever getting close to his private servers. But they did not know Harrison had already given me the keys. I looked at the transfer pending status on the screen. The $50 million was moving into my blind account. I had to redirect it tonight. My forensic mind had fully awakened. It was war. I stared at the blinking cursor, the stark reality of the situation washing over me like a bucket of ice water. The $50 million sitting in the pending transfer was not my inheritance. It was not a generous parting gift from a loving husband wanting to secure my future. It was blood money. It was the physical manifestation of a massive criminal conspiracy, a digital confession of corporate treason orchestrated by the people Harrison had trusted most. Naomi and Jackson had not just been skimming off the top to fund their lavish lifestyle. They had been actively gutting the foundation of Harrison's entire life's work. I opened a new command terminal and began compiling the evidence. Every forensic accountant knows that proving fraud requires more than just finding the destination account. You have to map the entire circulatory system of the theft. I needed to document exactly how Naomi, in her role as chief financial officer, had managed to bleed a highly regulated logistics empire dry without tripping a single external audit. I pulled up the digitized corporate ledgers I had backed up on my encrypted drive months ago. I cross-referenced the dates of the largest phantom vendor payouts with Naomi's executive authorizations. The pattern emerged with chilling clarity. Naomi had exploited a complex network of international shipping tariffs and currency exchange fluctuations. Whenever the logistics company handled massive cross-border freight contracts, Naomi would artificially inflate the projected operational losses. She would route the excess capital through a secondary payment gateway, an obscure software interface she had personally mandated the company adopt 2 years ago. The interface acted as a financial centrifuge, shattering large sums into thousands of microtransactions that slipped right past the automated compliance flags. Those microtransactions flowed directly into the Delaware shell company. From Delaware, the money washed through the Panamanian holding firm, a classic layering technique designed to break the chain of custody. Finally, it pooled into the master trust account in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Trust was an absolute fortress of financial secrecy. It was registered under a proxy director, but the underlying beneficiary documents I had just decrypted bore Jackson and Naomi's digital signatures. They had built a perfect machine for corporate theft. But perfection always leaves a residue. The problem with stealing $50 million is the sheer weight of the capital. Moving that much money requires constant maintenance, constant authorization, and constant vigilance. Harrison, despite his failing health, was a genius. He had noticed the discrepancies in the quarterly margins. He had seen the microscopic bleeding that the external auditors missed. And instead of confronting them right away, he had quietly engineered a counteroffensive. He had used his supreme executive override codes to hijack the Panamanian routing chain, funneling the stolen wealth into his own encrypted alpha fund. He had essentially stolen his own money back from the thieves. That realization hit me with a profound sense of sorrow and awe. Harrison had been fighting a silent war inside his own company entirely alone while his body failed him. He knew that bringing the police in immediately would trigger a massive public scandal, potentially destroying the logistics empire he had spent decades building. He needed absolute, irrefutable proof before he made his move. He had gathered the $50 million as the ultimate piece of evidence, and Naomi must have realized the trap was springing shut. I leaned back in the flimsy motel chair, my mind racing through the timeline. 3 weeks ago, Harrison had his medication regimen adjusted. Naomi had been the one to recommend the new private concierge doctor, a supposedly elite physician who specialized in post-stroke cardiovascular care. I had trusted her recommendation. I had allowed that doctor into our home. I had administered the pills he prescribed. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. Naomi had not just stolen money. She had orchestrated a medical assassination to protect her stolen fortune. The $50 million was the motive, the weapon, and the prize. And right now, That money was in transit to a blind account I controlled. Naomi and Jackson thought they had frozen my life by locking my personal bank accounts and throwing me out into the street. They assumed I was paralyzed by grief and poverty. They had no idea that I held the digital leash to their entire criminal enterprise. The pending transfer was scheduled to clear in less than 10 hours. If the money landed in my account, Naomi would twist the narrative. She would use the forged emergency injunction to claim I had hacked the company's servers and stolen the funds to flee the country. I could not let that happen. The money could not touch my personal accounts. If it did, I would become an accessory to wire fraud in the eyes of the law, exactly as Naomi had planned. I needed to weaponize the $50 million. I needed to turn Harrison's final protective measure into a devastating offensive strike. I opened my secure network protocols and began writing a custom routing script. I was not going to cancel the transfer. Canceling it would simply return the funds to the corporate ledger, allowing Naomi to bury the money back in the Cayman Islands and erase the digital paper trail forever. I had to redirect the transfer mid-flight. I needed a destination that Naomi could not touch, a vault that no probate lawyer or corrupted judge could freeze. I needed a federal Dropbox. My fingers flew across the keyboard, coding a bypass command that would intercept the $50 million the second it cleared the banking hold. I was going to route every single penny of the blood money directly into the hands of the people who could dismantle Naomi and Jackson's lives permanently. I pulled up the encrypted contact file from my old Chicago accounting days. I was ready. To execute this, I must act now. Perfect. I opened a fresh workspace. Money alone only proved fraud. Jackson and Naomi might claim corporate negligence or pin the embezzlement on a scapegoat. I needed to prove murder. I had to connect the stolen cash to Harrison experiencing a sudden cardiovascular collapse. I accessed Harrison's personal medical portal using the master passwords we shared. 3 weeks ago, Naomi had aggressively pushed us to hire Dr. Eris Thorne, a highly exclusive concierge physician. She claimed the company executive health plan covered his exorbitant retainer. At the time, I was so desperate for Harrison to recover from his stroke that I welcomed any elite medical intervention. Now, staring at the glaring white screen in the freezing motel room, I knew that decision had been a carefully orchestrated trap. I initiated a deep dive into Dr. Thorne. On the surface, he was impeccable. He possessed an Ivy League pedigree and a waiting list of billionaire clients. But forensic accounting is about looking past the shiny exterior and finding the dirty plumbing underneath. I ran his medical LLC through my proprietary tracking software, searching for any financial overlaps with Harrison Logistics' empire. The search algorithm churned for several tense minutes. The motel room felt completely silent, except for the frantic rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Then a massive data cluster appeared on my monitor. Naomi had indeed paid Dr. Thorne using the corporate executive health plan, but that was merely the public-facing transaction. By peeling back the digital layers of the corporate expense accounts, I found a secondary, highly concealed ledger. Naomi had authorized a separate consulting fee of $2 million to a biomedical research firm registered in Belize. I ran the Belizean entity through the Global Corporate Registry database. The registered agent for the firm was a proxy lawyer, but the primary shareholder was a holding company directly controlled by Dr. Eris Thorne. My blood turned to absolute ice. Naomi had not just hired a doctor, she had purchased a professional assassin. I needed to establish the exact timeline of the murder. I opened the pharmacy dispensing records attached to Harrison's patient file. Dr. Thorne had completely overhauled Harrison's daily medication regimen exactly 18 days ago. He had discontinued a standard reliable blood thinner and replaced it with an obscure, highly potent experimental cardiovascular drug. The medical justification noted in his digital file was aggressive stroke prevention. Next, I pulled up the internal company logs showing when Harrison first accessed the corrupted Panamanian routing chains. Harrison had initiated his own secret audit exactly 21 days ago. He had found the embezzlement, locked the stolen funds into the Alpha Fund, and prepared to expose his son and daughter-in-law. 3 days later, Naomi introduced Dr. Thorne to our family. The sequence of events was terrifyingly precise. Naomi realized Harrison was closing in on her $50 million theft. She knew he possessed the power to destroy her lucrative life and send her to prison. She needed him silenced immediately, but it had to look like a natural tragedy. A man recovering from a major stroke suffering a secondary fatal heart attack would raise zero suspicions among standard medical examiners. It was the perfect, untraceable crime. I dug deeper into the specific medication Dr. Thorne had prescribed. I accessed restricted medical databases and pharmacological warning registries. The drug was notorious for causing sudden cardiac arrest if administered at a specific dosage to patients with a history of arterial damage. Dr. Thorne had deliberately prescribed a lethal dose, masking it as an aggressive preventative measure. He had handed Harrison a loaded weapon, and I had unwittingly helped him pull the trigger by handing my husband those poisoned pills every single morning. A wave of profound sickness washed over me. I clamped my hand over my mouth, forcing myself to breathe through the overwhelming urge to vomit. They had turned my love and care for Harrison into the very instrument of his death. Naomi had orchestrated it all with the cold, calculating precision of a master tactician. She used the embezzled funds to pay the assassin, utilized her authority as CFO to hide the transaction, and wielded the emergency probate injunction to ensure I was thrown out of the house before I could ever secure the physical pill bottles for an independent toxicology screening. But she made one fatal error. She left a digital footprint. She believed her complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts was completely impenetrable. She assumed a grieving 34-year-old widow would be too broken, too ignorant, and too terrified to look behind the curtain. She forgot that I spent a decade tracing the darkest financial crimes in the country. I aggressively compiled every piece of evidence. I took the wire transfers from the corporate ledger to the Delaware Shell Company. I grabbed the routing data from Panama to the Cayman Islands. I captured the digital signatures proving Naomi and Jackson were the sole beneficiaries of the stolen $50 million. Then I attached the medical payment logs linking Naomi to Dr. Thorne, $2 million blood money payoff. I bundled the entire devastating package into a single heavily encrypted master file. This was no longer just a case of probate theft or simple embezzlement. It was a massive federal conspiracy to commit murder for ultimate financial gain. The digital clock in the corner of my screen indicated it was now 4 a.m. The pending transfer of the $50 million was scheduled to execute in just 8 hours. I had the explicit motive. I had the murder weapon. I had the absolute proof of their guilt. I opened my secure communication protocol and loaded the contact information for Agent Carter. He was a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in white-collar crime and corporate homicide. We had worked together on a massive case in Chicago 5 years ago. He knew my work, and he trusted my forensic analysis implicitly. I typed a brief, urgent message requesting a secure line. The trap was fully constructed. Naomi and Jackson thought they had buried Harrison along with their secrets. They were about to discover that some secrets refused to stay buried. The harsh morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of the motel room, signaling the start of a new day. My phone vibrated against the cheap laminate desk. It was an unsaved number, but the text message was unmistakable in its arrogant brevity. Meet us at the espresso bar on 5th Avenue in 1 hour. Do not be late. We have a proposition for you. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a steady, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. Naomi and Jackson were getting restless. The pending transfer of the $50 million was ticking closer to its clearance deadline. They needed me to cancel the wire before the banking hold expired, and they assumed a night in a freezing, rundown motel would have completely broken my spirit. They wanted to negotiate my surrender. I quickly closed my encrypted laptop, safely stashing it in my oversized leather bag. I splashed cold water on my face in the rusted bathroom sink, smoothing down the wrinkles of the beige blouse I had been wearing since Harrison died. I looked exhausted, pale, and utterly defeated. It was the perfect disguise. I hailed another cheap cab and made my way to the upscale downtown cafe. The espresso bar was a favorite among Seattle corporate elites, featuring sleek marble countertops, modern brass fixtures, and a clientele dressed in tailored suits. I walked through the glass doors feeling the immediate judgmental stares of the patrons. I found an empty booth in the far corner and slid into the leather seat, clutching my bag tightly to my chest. Exactly 10 minutes later, Jackson and Naomi walked in. Naomi commanded the room effortlessly. She wore a stunning emerald green sheath dress that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin, her hair pulled back into a severe, flawless bun. She projected absolute corporate dominance. Jackson trailed slightly behind her, wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin. He looked like a man who had already won the war. They slid into the booth across from me. Neither of them ordered a coffee. This was not a friendly chat. This was an execution. "You look terrible," Lauren Jackson remarked, leaning back against the leather cushion. "Reality hitting you finally." A cheap motel is quite a downgrade from the Beacon Hill estate. I hope the reality check was sufficiently uncomfortable. I kept my eyes downcast, intentionally avoiding his gaze to sell my performance of a broken widow. "What do you want, Jackson?" I asked, letting my voice waver slightly. Naomi took control immediately. She opened her designer briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it squarely in the center of the marble table and rested her manicured hands over it. "We are here to offer you a graceful exit," Naomi said, her tone smooth and heavily patronizing. "We understand that losing Harrison was a shock. We also understand that panic makes people do irrational things like attempting to steal $50 million from a family business. But we are willing to be reasonable." She slid the envelope across the table until it touched my hands. "Open it." I peeled back the flap of the envelope. Inside rested a cashier check made out to my name. The amount was exactly $1 million. Behind the check was a dense, multi-page legal document. "That is a standard non-disclosure agreement and a full waiver of your inheritance rights," Naomi explained, watching my face intently for a reaction. "You sign that document legally forfeiting any claim to Harrison Estate, the house, and the company assets. You also agree to a permanent gag order regarding the events of last night. In exchange, you take that check, you cancel the pending wire transfer immediately, and you walk away." $1 million, I whispered, staring at the paper. "You are trying to buy my silence for $1 million. Do not act insulted," Jackson scoffed, leaning forward. "It is $1 million more than you actually deserve. You should be thanking us on your hands and knees." Naomi raised a hand, silencing her husband. She leaned across the table, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "Let me make the alternative completely clear to you, Lauren. If you refuse to sign that agreement, or if you refuse to cancel the wire transfer, I will personally ensure you are destroyed." She tapped a single perfectly polished fingernail against the marble table. "The autopsy report on Harrison is currently pending. As you know, he suffered a sudden, fatal cardiovascular event. But what you do not know is that my legal team is prepared to file a formal request for a specialized toxicology screening. We have already briefed the authorities on your concerning behavior over the past few weeks." My breath caught in my throat. I did not have to fake my shock. She was actually threatening to frame me for the murder she had orchestrated. "We will tell the police that you were the one managing his medications," Naomi continued, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "We will claim you intentionally administered a lethal overdose because you knew he was planning to divorce you. You were the only one alone with him when he collapsed. Combine that with your frantic attempt to wire $50 million to a hidden offshore account while he was dying, and any jury in the country will convict you of first-degree murder." "You would not dare," I choked out, forcing my hands to tremble as I gripped the edge of the table. "Try me," Naomi countered, her smile razor-thin and utterly devoid of humanity. "I will bury you so deep in a federal penitentiary that you will forget what the sun looks like. I hold all the cards, Lauren. The company, the lawyers, the medical narrative. You have absolutely nothing. Take the $1 million and disappear, or spend the rest of your life in a concrete cell." Jackson smirked, clearly enjoying the display of ruthless power. "Time is ticking, Lauren. The bank hold on that transfer expires tonight. We need your signature, and we need you to log into your portal and cancel the wire right now." I stared at the check, then at the non-disclosure agreement. My mind raced, processing the incredible arrogance sitting across from me. They had handed me the final piece of the puzzle. Naomi had essentially confessed to her willingness to manipulate Harrison's toxicology report, proving she had intimate knowledge of the exact poisoned pills Dr. Thorne had prescribed. She felt completely untouchable. I needed to give them a victory. I needed them to drop their guard and feel entirely secure so I could execute the trap I had built. I slumped my shoulders, letting a tear slip down my cheek. I looked away, projecting absolute, total surrender. "Okay," I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. "You win. I will sign it." Jackson let out a harsh bark of laughter. Smart girl, finally realizing her place. "But I cannot cancel the wire from here," I lied, looking up at Naomi with wide, fearful eyes. "The banking protocol requires me to be on a secure, authenticated network to reverse a transaction of that magnitude. If I try to do it on a public cafe network, the bank will freeze the account for suspicious activity, and the money will be locked in an investigative hold for months. I need to do it at the company office or at the memorial service where I can access the encrypted family server." Naomi narrowed her eyes, evaluating my statement. As a chief financial officer, she knew that high-level wire transfers required strict security authentications. The lie was highly technical and entirely plausible. "Fine," Naomi said, her tone sharp. "We are hosting a private memorial gathering for the board of directors and the family tomorrow evening at the Four Seasons. You will bring your laptop. You will sign the documents in front of our lawyer, and you will cancel the transfer on the secure network. If you try to run, the police will be waiting. I will be there," I promised, wiping my face. "I just want this to be over." Naomi stood up, smoothing her emerald dress. "Make sure you are on time, Lauren. I hate to be kept waiting." They turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving the $1 million check and the contract on the table. I watched them go, maintaining my facade of a broken widow, until they disappeared down the street. Then I carefully folded the contract and slid it into my bag. My tears dried instantly. The trap was set. Now I just had to prepare for the execution. I stepped out of the cafe into the biting Seattle wind, but I did not hail a cab immediately. I needed to solidify the narrative Naomi had constructed. If they were going to believe I was a defeated, terrified widow on the verge of a psychological collapse, I had to give them a performance worthy of an audience. Naomi and Jackson were undeniably having me followed. People who embezzle $50 million and orchestrate a cardiovascular assassination do not simply walk away and trust their victim to comply. They watch. They verify. I spotted a dark sedan idling across the street, its tinted windows barely concealing the silhouette of a driver whose gaze was fixed squarely on me. Perfect. I let my shoulders slump, deliberately ruining my posture. I stumbled slightly as I walked down the pavement, making sure to pull my phone from my bag with visibly shaking hands. I needed them to report back to Naomi that I was spiraling. I dialed a number I had memorized from the legal documents Naomi had thrown at me. Bradley, the probate lawyer. The line rang twice before his slick, arrogant voice answered. "Bradley and Associates." "Bradley, it is, Lauren!" I gasped, pitching my voice up an octave and forcing my breathing to become rapid and shallow. I injected pure, unadulterated panic into my tone. "Please, you have to talk to Naomi. You have to make her understand that I am not trying to run. I am terrified." There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear his smug satisfaction. "Calm down, Lauren. Hysterics will not help your legal standing. Have you reviewed the settlement agreement?" "I am looking at it right now," I sobbed, clutching the phone tightly against my ear while stealing a covert glance at the idling sedan. "I will sign it. I swear I will sign it. I do not want the house. I do not want the company. I just do not want to go to a federal prison. Please, you cannot let her file those toxicology reports." Harrison was already sick. I was just trying to follow his instructions. I was confused. I leaned against a brick building, sinking slowly until I was crouching on the cold sidewalk. It was an incredibly degrading posture, but it was exactly what the private investigator across the street needed to photograph. A broken, pathetic gold digger sobbing in the gutter. Naomi is a very reasonable woman when she is not being actively robbed, Bradley replied, his tone dripping with condescension. If you execute the cancellation of the wire transfer and sign the non-disclosure agreement, she will suppress the medical investigation, but you have to follow her exact instructions. I will, I cried, letting out a ragged, desperate breath. But I need a guarantee. I need to know she will not take the signed papers and press charges anyway. I need witnesses. Witnesses? Bradley scoffed. You are in no position to make demands, Lauren. It is not a demand. It is a plea. I whined, pouring on the desperation. I will do the network cancellation at the memorial service tomorrow, just like she asked. But I want the entire board of directors in the room when I sign the waiver. I want them to see me surrender the assets. I will apologize to Jackson and Naomi in front of everyone. I just need powerful people in the room to guarantee my physical and legal safety once I hand over the $50 million. If they see me cooperate, Naomi will not be able to secretly arrest me afterward. Please, Bradley, let me humiliate myself in front of the board and I will give you everything. I held my breath, waiting for the bait to be taken. I knew exactly how narcissistic personalities operated. Naomi did not just want her stolen fortune secured. She wanted absolute crushing victory. She wanted to watch me grovel in front of the very corporate titans who had judged our marriage. The idea of me sobbing and confessing my defeat before the entire logistics board of directors would be an irresistible feast for her ego. Hold the line, Bradley commanded. I remained crouched on the sidewalk, listening to the muffled hold music. The wind whipped my hair across my face. I kept my expression twisted in artificial agony for the benefit of the watching investigator. 2 minutes passed, then 3. I knew Bradley was conferring with Naomi. I could picture her in her tailored emerald dress, eyes gleaming with triumph as she imagined my public surrender. Bradley returned to the line. Naomi accepts your terms. The board of directors will be gathered in the private suite at the Four Seasons immediately following the public memorial service. You will arrive at exactly 6 in the evening. You will bring your laptop. You will log into the encrypted family server, cancel the pending transfer, and sign the inheritance waiver in front of the board. If you deviate from this plan by a single syllable, the police will be waiting in the lobby with handcuffs. Do we have an understanding? Yes, I whimpered, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Tell her I am sorry. Just be on time, Lauren. Bradley hung up. I lowered the phone from my ear. I remained crouched on the sidewalk for another 30 seconds, keeping my head buried in my hands. I let my shoulders heave as if I were weeping uncontrollably. Then I stood up. I brushed the dirt off my knees, adjusted my coat, and looked directly at the dark sedan across the street. The tears were completely gone. My heart was beating with calm, icy precision. The frantic, terrified widow vanished, replaced entirely by the forensic auditor who was about to dismantle an empire. Naomi had agreed to assemble the entire board of directors in one room. She thought she was setting the stage for my ultimate public humiliation. She had no idea she had just provided me with the perfect audience for her own execution. I needed them all there. I needed the executives, the shareholders, and the corporate lawyers to witness the digital blood trail I was about to expose. If I only confronted Naomi and Jackson privately, they could spin the narrative or use their immense wealth to bury the evidence. But with the board watching the raw financial data unspool in real time, there would be no escape. I hailed another cab and directed the driver back to the dingy motel. The ride was silent. I stared out the window at the passing Seattle skyline, thinking of Harrison. He had spent his life building a legacy of integrity, only to be poisoned by the very people who stood to inherit it. They had mocked his intelligence and underestimated his final act of defiance. They had also critically underestimated his wife. I walked back into my freezing motel room and locked the deadbolt. I pulled the non-disclosure agreement from my bag and tossed it onto the bed. It was a worthless piece of paper, a monument to Naomi's hubris. I had exactly 24 hours until the memorial service. I needed to finalize the evidence package and prepare the ultimate delivery method. I opened my encrypted laptop. The screen flashed to life, displaying the pending $50 million transfer. The clock was ticking. It was time to make a very important phone call to the federal government. I pulled a secondary burner phone from the hidden lining of my leather bag. During my years dissecting financial crimes in Chicago, I learned to never rely on a single device when dealing with sophisticated corporate predators. I powered it on and connected it to the motel's unstable wireless network through a triple-layered virtual private network. I opened a secure messaging application that utilized end-to-end encryption and typed a specific numerical sequence. The sequence was an old emergency beacon. It belonged to Special Agent David Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Carter and I had a history. 5 years ago, before I retired to marry Harrison, I was the lead forensic auditor on a task force that dismantled a massive tri-state money laundering syndicate. Carter was the lead federal agent on that case. He knew my methods. He knew I never exaggerated a financial discrepancy. And he knew I never called unless I had absolute, irrefutable proof of a felony. I stared at the screen as the encrypted line established a connection. The phone rang once before a sharp voice answered. Carter speaking. David, it is Lauren. There was a heavy pause on the line. The ambient noise of a busy federal bullpen echoed in the background before a door clicked shut, leaving only silence. Lauren. I thought you retired to play house in Seattle. What is going on? Your voice sounds incredibly tight. Harrison is dead, I said flatly. He passed away just a few hours ago. Jesus, Lauren, I am so sorry. Was it another stroke? That is what his son and daughter-in-law want the medical examiner to believe, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. But it was not a stroke. It was a targeted cardiovascular assassination orchestrated to cover up a $50 million corporate embezzlement scheme. I heard the squeak of a leather office chair as Carter sat up straight. You realize what you're saying, right? That is a massive accusation. Who are the suspects? Jackson, my stepson, and Naomi, his wife. She is the chief financial officer of Harrison's logistics company. She has been bleeding the corporate accounts dry for 4 years, using a highly sophisticated layering technique. She routed millions through phantom vendors in Delaware, washed the cash through a Panamanian holding firm, and consolidated it into a master trust in the Cayman Islands. Carter let out a low whistle. A Cayman trust is nearly impossible to pierce without an international subpoena. Even if you suspect she is stealing, proving she is the ultimate beneficiary could take years. I already pierced it, I stated. I have the digital incorporation documents. Naomi and Jackson are the sole listed beneficiaries. But that is not why I'm calling you David. Harrison found out about the theft. He used his executive override to pull all $50 million back from the offshore accounts. He trapped the money in a hidden domestic fund to use as evidence against them. Naomi realized she was caught. She hired a concierge physician to prescribe Harrison a lethal dose of experimental cardiovascular medication. They murdered him to protect their stolen fortune. The silence on the line was deafening. When Carter finally spoke, his voice was all business. The easy banter of old colleagues was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a federal investigator. Do you have the proof, Lauren? Actual actionable data? I cannot authorize a raid on a prominent corporate executive based on a hunch. I am sending you a secure data packet right now, I said, my fingers flying across my laptop keyboard. I hit the execution command, firing the encrypted file across the network directly to Carter's federal server. Open it. I listened to the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Give me the password. I recited a 12-character alphanumeric string. I heard his breath catch as the files populated on his monitor. Look at folder A, I instructed. Those are the corporate expense ledgers overlaid with the Panamanian routing numbers. Notice the microtransactions. Naomi used an obscure payment gateway to smurf the stolen funds right past the automated compliance flags. Now open folder B. Those are the Cayman Trust beneficiary signatures. This is incredible. Carter muttered, his voice thick with absolute disbelief. You mapped the entire laundering network in less than an hour. I mapped it while sitting in a freezing motel room after they forged a probate injunction to evict me from my own home, I clarified. Now open folder C. That is the smoking gun. It links a $2 million consulting fee authorized by Naomi directly to a Belizean biomedical research firm owned by Dr. Eris Thorne. That is the man who prescribed the fatal medication to Harrison 18 days ago. Lauren, if this data holds up to verification, we are looking at federal wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. But we have a major jurisdictional problem. The money is still in the company network. Unless they actually take possession of the funds, proving intent to steal the consolidated $50 million is going to be a grueling legal battle. Their high-priced lawyers will tie us up in federal court for a decade. They are going to take possession of the funds tomorrow night. I revealed a cold smile touching my lips. Explain. Harrison initiated a wire transfer of the entire $50 million to a blind account right before he died. The transfer is currently sitting in a 48-hour banking hold. Naomi and Jackson are forcing me to log into the corporate server tomorrow evening during a private memorial gathering with the board of directors. They want me to cancel the transfer and sign an inheritance waiver. If I do not comply, they have explicitly threatened to frame me for Harrison's murder using manipulated toxicology reports. Carter swore under his breath. They are trying to force you to return the evidence to their control. If you cancel that wire, Naomi will instantly reroute the cash back to the Caymans and erase the internal ledgers. The money will vanish permanently. I am not going to cancel the wire, David. I am going to redirect it. I pulled up the custom routing script I had been coding all night. I have built a bypass command. When they force me to access the server in front of the board of directors, I am going to execute a forced diversion. I need you to provide me with the exact routing and account numbers for the Department of Justice escrow evidence account. I'm going to slam all $50 million directly into federal custody. A harsh laugh erupted from Carter. You are going to wire $50 million of stolen corporate funds into a federal evidence vault in front of the entire board of directors. Yes. And I need you and your strike team waiting in the lobby of the Four Seasons Hotel tomorrow at exactly 6 in the evening. When that money hits your escrow account, I want you to breach the room and arrest Naomi and Jackson for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. I will verify the data packets immediately, Carter said, the thrill of the hunt evident in his voice. If this routing data checks out, I will have the warrant signed by a federal judge before noon. I will bring a full tactical team. We will be waiting in the wings, Lauren. Do not let them see you coming. They think I am a broken, terrified widow, I said, staring at the flashing cursor on my screen. They think they have already won. We finalized the tactical logistics, coordinating the exact timing of the sting operation. I disconnected the call and destroyed the burner phone, shattering the plastic casing under the heel of my boot. I turned back to my laptop, entering the federal routing numbers Carter had provided into my bypass script. The code was perfect. The digital trap was fully armed and primed for execution. I leaned back in the cheap motel chair, watching the sun rise over the Seattle skyline. Naomi wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the corporate elite. I was going to give her a show she would never forget. I watched the sun rise over the Seattle skyline, painting the gray clouds with streaks of bruised purple and gold. Naomi wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the corporate elite. I was going to give her a show she would never forget. I turned away from the window and rubbed my exhausted eyes. I had exactly 12 hours before I needed to walk into the Four Seasons Hotel. The hard part was not figuring out the crime. The hard part was building a digital trap so flawless that the chief financial officer of a billion-dollar logistics empire would not see it coming until the steel cuffs were already locked around her wrists. I opened a specialized coding environment on my laptop. Naomi was going to force me to log into the corporate banking portal. She would stand over my shoulder and watch me click the specific bright red button labeled Cancel Pending Transfer. To her, that click meant victory. It meant the $50 million would revert to the internal company ledger, where she could instantly plunge it back into the Cayman Islands Trust. I needed to give her the visual satisfaction of that click. I began writing a localized interface overlay. It was a sophisticated digital mask that would sit perfectly on top of the genuine banking portal. To anyone watching the screen, it would look identical to the standard corporate interface. but I was fundamentally rewiring the back-end command hierarchy. I linked the graphic coordinates of the cancellation button to the bypass script I had written earlier with Agent Carter. When my cursor struck that specific pixel zone, the system would not send a cancellation ping to the bank. Instead, it would act as an irrevocable execution command. It would aggressively authorize the pending transfer and instantaneously reroute the entire $50 million into the Department of Justice escrow evidence account. I typed line after line of alphanumeric code, my fingers finding a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pace. I was building what forensic auditors called a dead man switch. Once that button was pressed, the sequence could not be aborted. Not by me, not by Naomi, and not by any emergency network override she might attempt to deploy from her own devices. But I had to plan for contingencies. What if Jackson realized what I was doing and tried to physically rip the laptop from my hands? What if Bradley, the probate lawyer, demanded to inspect the machine before I initiated the sequence? I coded a secondary trigger mechanism. I linked the execution command to a specific keystroke combination. If anyone tried to forcibly close the laptop lid, or if an incorrect master password was entered, the system would immediately lock the screen, wipe the local hard drive to protect my forensic data, and silently push the routing command through the background server. The money was going to the federal government, no matter what happened in that VIP room. I spent the next 4 hours running rigorous diagnostic simulations. I launched a virtual sandbox environment on my desktop mimicking the exact security parameters of the logistics company servers. I ran the fake cancellation protocol 30 different times. Every single time, the visual interface performed flawlessly, mimicking a standard cancellation graphic, while the background data showed the $50 million slamming securely into the simulated federal vault. The code was impenetrable. The digital guillotine was rigged and ready to drop. I checked the time. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. I closed the laptop, placed it carefully into a waterproof sleeve, and tucked it into my leather bag. My technical preparations were completely finished. Now I needed to prepare myself physically. I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above the motel sink. I looked exactly like the shattered victim Naomi expected to see. My hair was tangled. My skin was pale, and the beige blouse I wore was still crumpled and stained with Harrison's blood. I could not walk into an upscale hotel looking like a desperate vagrant. If I looked too chaotic, the hotel security might block my entry before I ever reached the memorial gathering. Furthermore, I refused to let Harrison's board of directors see me as the pathetic gold digger Naomi had painted me to be. I left the motel carrying my bag tightly against my side. I walked 3 blocks down the gritty commercial avenue until I found a mid-range department store. I walked straight to the women professional section. I used $40 of my remaining cash to buy a simple sharp black blazer and a matching pair of slacks. It was nowhere near the tailored designer clothing I was accustomed to wearing at Beacon Hill, but the clean dark lines gave me a shield of professional armor. I used the remaining $2 to buy a cheap coffee, asking the barista for a cup of ice water on the side. I took the clothes and the water into the store restroom. I stripped off the ruined beige blouse, throwing it directly into the trash can. I used the ice water and paper towels to scrub the exhaustion and grime from my face. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun at the nape of my neck, mimicking the rigid, aggressive styling Naomi favored. I slipped into the black slacks and buttoned the sharp black blazer. I stared at the mirror. The grieving, terrified widow was entirely gone. The woman looking back at me was cold, calculating, and ready for war. I stepped back out onto the street. The heavy Seattle rain had subsided into a pervasive, chilling drizzle. The gray afternoon sky mirrored the grim reality of the day. Harrison was dead, murdered by the people he had raised and trusted. My heart ached with a profound, hollow sorrow, but I forcefully pushed the grief down into a locked box in the back of my mind. I would mourn my husband tomorrow. Today I had to be his executioner. I walked another 2 blocks to a busy transit center and boarded a public bus, heading toward the downtown financial district. The ride was a slow, agonizing crawl through rush-hour traffic. I kept my hand resting firmly on my leather bag, feeling the solid weight of the laptop pressing against my leg. At exactly 5:45 in the evening, the bus pulled to a stop 2 blocks away from the Four Seasons Hotel. I stepped off onto the wet pavement, pulling my blazer tightly around myself against the biting wind. The towering glass facade of the hotel loomed ahead, glowing with warm golden light against the darkening city skyline. I walked toward the grand entrance, my posture impeccably straight. My heels clicked a steady rhythmic cadence against the concrete. I approached the heavy brass doors of the hotel lobby. I was walking directly into the lion den, completely unarmed except for a laptop and a brilliant piece of code. I took one final steadying breath and pushed the doors open. The sudden warmth of the Four Seasons lobby washed over me, a sharp contrast to the freezing Seattle rain. The air smelled of expensive lilies, polished mahogany, and old money. The concierge staff murmured in hushed, respectful tones, expertly directing a steady stream of the city corporate elite toward the grand ballroom on the second floor. I blended into the periphery of the crowd, keeping my head perfectly high and my leather bag firmly pressed against my ribs. As I ascended the sweeping marble staircase, the low hum of somber networking grew progressively louder. This was not a genuine memorial service for a beloved father and husband. I knew these people. I knew this world. This was a high-stakes corporate transition of power, expertly wrapped in black velvet and fake tears. I stepped through the heavy double mahogany doors and into the grand ballroom. The space was breathtakingly opulent, designed specifically to project wealth and stability. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of invited guests. Tasteful, extravagant floral arrangements flanked a massive portrait of Harrison that stood at the center of the stage. In the photograph, he looked handsome, commanding, and fiercely alive. A sudden violent pang of genuine grief hit my chest, threatening to shatter my carefully constructed armor. I dug my fingernails into my palms, ruthlessly locking the pain away. I could not afford to be a widow right now. I had to be a forensic auditor walking into a crime scene. I scanned the expansive room. It did not take long to locate my targets. Jackson and Naomi were positioned perfectly near the front of the ballroom, holding court like corporate royalty. They were putting on an absolute masterclass in manipulation and public relations. Jackson wore a bespoke black morning suit, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He was currently speaking to the company chief operations officer, his head bowed respectfully, his free hand resting over his heart in a flawless display of stoic masculine heartbreak. Naomi stood right beside him, exuding quiet power. She wore a somber but stunningly tailored black designer dress that commanded respect. She lightly rubbed Jackson back as he spoke, projecting the pristine image of a devoted, fiercely protective wife. But I watched her eyes. They were sharp, calculated, and entirely devoid of sorrow. She was rapidly scanning the room, assessing the board members, securing their loyalty. She was silently assuring the anxious shareholders that the logistics empire financial future was entirely safe in her highly capable hands. Then someone near the entrance noticed me. The shift in the room atmosphere was palpable and immediate. The polite, low murmur of corporate conversation dropped a full octave, replaced by a tense, electric silence. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Whispers erupted like small brush fires across the ballroom. Jackson's social media broadcast from that morning had clearly reached every single person in this room. They had all watched his tearful, fabricated video accusing me of attempting to steal $50 million from a dying man. A physical path literally cleared in front of me as I walked further into the ballroom. Wives of wealthy executives pulled their husbands away by the arm as I approached, treating me like a walking contagion. People I had graciously hosted for dinner at the Beacon Hill estate just weeks ago actively turned their backs, entirely refusing to make eye contact. I was a pariah. In their eyes, I was the manipulative gold-digging murderer who had been caught red-handed trying to gut Harrison estate. I spotted an older man standing near the catering tables. It was a board member who had always praised my business acumen during company galas. I gave him a small, polite nod, seeking just one familiar face of basic human decency. The executive glared at me with absolute, undisguised revulsion. He turned on his heel purposefully, turning his back on me, and walked straight over to join Jackson Inner Circle. The message was loud and undeniably clear. The board had already chosen their side. I was completely excommunicated. Jackson noticed the sudden commotion rippling through the crowd. He looked across the sea of expensive black suits and locked eyes with me. His gaze was entirely devoid of grief, replaced by a sickening, arrogant triumph. He gave me a microscopic, mocking smirk, raising his scotch glass a fraction of an inch in a silent, sarcastic toast. He was gloating. He was reveling in my absolute public destruction. Naomi did not even bother to look at me. She simply checked her diamond-encrusted watch, subtly signaling that our scheduled deadline was rapidly approaching. They were deliberately letting the crowd isolate and humiliate me, softening me up for the final slaughter. They wanted me feeling small, hated, and utterly desperate to comply with their demands. They wanted me to walk into that private VIP room completely broken, eager to sign away my rights, just to escape the crushing weight of public judgment. The isolation was supposed to crush me. Naomi had engineered this exact scenario, ensuring that every board member, every shareholder, and every family friend viewed me as a toxic pariah before the critical meeting even began. She wanted me starved of allies. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of the establishment aligned against me, so that when the moment came to sign the non-disclosure agreement, I would surrender without a single word of protest. I walked toward the back of the ballroom, finding a quiet, shadowed corner near the hallway that led to the executive suites. I stood alone, gripping the strap of my leather bag, feeling the solid weight of the laptop resting securely against my hip. Let them stare. Let them whisper their vicious, fabricated rumors. Their contempt meant absolutely nothing to me. In less than 20 minutes, the entire hierarchy of this room was going to burn to the ground. Exactly at 6 o'clock, a burly security guard in a dark suit approached my shadowed corner. He gestured sharply toward the discreet hallway located just behind the main stage. The time had come. I tightened my grip on the leather bag and followed him away from the glaring lights of the ballroom. The heavy, ambient noise of the crowd faded instantly as the guard pushed open a thick mahogany door, ushering me into the executive VIP boardroom. The atmosphere inside the room was suffocatingly tense, heavy with the silent judgment of the corporate elite who had gathered to witness my execution. A massive, polished oak conference table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and open hostility. At the far end of the table sat Chairman Thompson, a man who had feasted at my dining table for years, but now refused to even acknowledge my presence. Flanking him were 5 other senior board members of the logistics empire. Their faces were set in identical masks of stone-cold judgment. Bradley the probate shark sat adjacent to the chairman. He was meticulously arranging a terrifyingly thick stack of legal documents. Jackson and Naomi stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked city. Naomi looked utterly radiant in her victory. She uncrossed her arms and walked slowly toward the head of the table, pulling out a chair with a deliberate, commanding scrape against the hardwood floor. "Take a seat, Lauren," Naomi instructed, gesturing to a solitary chair positioned at the opposite end of the long table. It was an interrogation setup, designed perfectly to make me feel small, isolated, and entirely overpowered by the corporate machinery arrayed against me. I walked forward, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, and took the seat. I kept my head slightly bowed, maintaining the illusion of a broken, defeated woman. I placed my leather bag on the floor next to my ankle and rested my hands on my lap. I forced them to tremble just a fraction. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries." Chairman Thompson began, his voice gravelly and devoid of any warmth. "The board has been fully briefed on the situation by our chief financial officer. We are aware of your unauthorized attempt to wire $50 million of corporate capital to a hidden offshore account while our founder was drawing his final breaths. The sheer audacity of your actions has put this entire company at risk." I looked up, letting a manufactured look of panic wash over my face. "I was just following his instructions," I pleaded, my voice cracking perfectly. "Harrison told me to move it. He said he needed to protect the funds." Jackson let out a harsh, echoing laugh that bounced off the mahogany-paneled walls. Protect the funds from whom, Lauren? The people actually running his company. You manipulated a dying man whose brain was literally bleeding out. You are lucky we are allowing you to walk out of this hotel, rather than having you escorted out in handcuffs by the local police. Bradley tapped his expensive fountain pen against the stack of papers. The narrative is irrelevant right now. What matters is the strict execution of this settlement. Mrs. Lauren and I have prepared the final non-disclosure agreements and the complete waiver of your inheritance rights. By signing these documents, you legally forfeit any and all claims to the estate, the Beacon Hill property, and any liquid assets connected to the logistics firm. In exchange, the board agrees to withhold the criminal fraud charges and release a $1 million cashier check to you immediately. He slid the massive stack of papers down the length of the polished table. They stopped right in front of me. The blank signature line glared up at me. Naomi leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her dark eyes bored into me, stripping away any remaining pretense of civility. The papers are secondary, Lauren. The priority is the wire transfer. You will open your laptop right now. You will log into the secure corporate portal using the localized network we have provided. You will cancel the pending $50 million transaction, routing the funds directly back to the master corporate ledger where they belong. Only after that money is confirmed secure will you receive your settlement check. I looked at the board members. None of them flinched at Naomi dictating terms like a mob boss. They were so blinded by their greed and their desire to protect the company stock price that they blindly trusted their chief financial officer. They had absolutely no idea they were aiding and abetting a murderer. "What if I just walk away?" I whimpered, shrinking back into my chair. "What if I just leave the money alone and let the probate court handle it?" Naomi stood up, placing her hands flat on the oak table. "If you walk out that door without canceling the transfer, I will authorize Bradley to file the amended toxicology reports. I will personally hand the police the forged statements from the household staff claiming you abused Harrison. You will not make it past the hotel lobby before they arrest you for murder. You have zero leverage, Lauren. Open the laptop." I let a single heavy tear spill over my eyelashes and roll down my cheek. I sniffled, reaching down to unzip my leather bag. I slowly pulled out the encrypted laptop, placing it gently onto the table. Bradley pulled a secondary monitor from a briefcase and connected a visual mirroring cable to the side of my machine. "The board requires visual confirmation of the cancellation," he explained coldly. "We will watch you execute the command on this screen." I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed on my keyboard. I hit the power button. The screen glowed to life. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password, unlocking the primary drive. My hands were visibly shaking now, but this time it was not a performance. The adrenaline was pounding through my veins like battery acid. We were seconds away from the execution. I opened the secure banking application. The interface loaded, projecting my screen perfectly onto the large monitor sitting in front of Bradley and the board of directors. The room collectively held its breath as the financial dashboard appeared in stark, high-resolution detail. There it was, $50,340,000. The status indicator pulsed with a bright yellow warning, pending clearance. "Right there," Jackson ordered, pointing a stiff finger at the monitor. "Click the red button. Cancel it right now." I moved my hand over the trackpad. The cursor glided across the screen, hovering directly over the bright red cancellation command. This was the exact pixel zone I had rewired during my grueling hours in the motel room. To everyone in the room, it looked like a standard banking interface. They were completely unaware that my hidden bypass script was coiled underneath that button, ready to strike like a viper. Naomi watched my finger hover over the trackpad. Her chest rose and fell with eager anticipation. "Do it, Lauren. Give us back our money." I paused. I lifted my head and looked away from the glowing screen. I looked directly into Naomi's arrogant, calculating eyes. Then I looked at Jackson, who was practically vibrating with greed. I let the pathetic broken widow facade drop completely. My posture straightened. The manufactured fear vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of pure forensic fury. "It was never your money, Naomi," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear authority that shattered the quiet tension of the room. It was always his, and he knew exactly how you stole every last dime of it. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, the kind of profound, heavy silence that typically precedes a catastrophic explosion. Naomi's perfect mask cracked. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic breaking through her calculated exterior before she quickly forced it down. She let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, looking toward Chairman Thompson and the rest of the board. "She is having a psychotic break," Naomi announced, her voice pitched to convey mock sympathy mixed with exasperation. "The grief has completely unhinged her. Bradley, call hotel security. We need to have her escorted out before she hurts herself." Bradley reached into his pocket for his phone, but I slammed my hand flat against the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Put the phone down, Bradley," I commanded. My voice held zero hysterical notes. It was cold, precise, and carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "If security walks through those doors, the financial data I am about to project onto this screen will go directly to the Wall Street Journal instead of remaining confined to this room." Bradley froze, his hand hovering over his pocket. Chairman Thompson frowned, his thick white eyebrows drawing together as he looked from Naomi to me. "What are you talking about?" Lauren Thompson demanded. His tone was wary, but the executive in him was listening. Corporate survival instinct always trumps loyalty. I pushed the non-disclosure agreement and the $1 million check away from me. I slid them across the polished wood until they fell over the edge and fluttered uselessly onto the floor. I stood up slowly. "Allow me to properly introduce myself, Chairman Thompson," I said, locking eyes with the most powerful man in the room. "You all know me as Harrison's young wife, the former interior decorator, the gold digger who spent her days planning garden parties. That is the narrative Naomi so carefully crafted for you." I took a step to the side, distancing myself from the solitary chair they had placed me in. "But before I met your founder, I was a senior forensic auditor at a top-tier financial crimes firm in Chicago. I spent a decade dismantling international money laundering syndicates and corporate embezzlement rings. I tracked ghost funds for a living. I see the financial architecture that external auditors overlook." Jackson's face flushed a deep, violent red. "Shut up," he hissed, taking a step toward me. "Shut your mouth right now, you lying fraud." "Sit down, Jackson," Chairman Thompson barked. The older man leaned forward, his gaze fixed firmly on my face. "Let her speak." Naomi's hands were gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned pure white. "Chairman, you cannot possibly entertain this delusion. She is trying to distract us from the fact that she initiated a $50 million wire transfer while Harrison was in a coma. I initiated the transfer because Harrison gave me the bypass codes 36 hours ago. While he was fully conscious, I shot back, my voice slicing through Naomi's desperate defense. He begged me to move the funds because he had finally gathered the ultimate proof of your massive corporate treason." I turned my attention entirely to the board of directors. I had their undivided attention. For the past 4 years, this company has experienced surging operational costs. I stated, shifting into full presentation mode. "You were told it was due to international shipping tariffs and unavoidable supply chain disruptions. Naomi presented you with beautifully formatted quarterly reports to justify the shrinking profit margins. But the margins were not shrinking naturally. They were being bled out." I watched the color drain from Naomi's face. She knew exactly what was coming. "Your chief financial officer utilized a secondary payment gateway." I continued, pointing a firm finger directly at Naomi. "She shattered massive freight contracts into thousands of microtransactions. This is a classic money laundering technique known as smurfing, designed specifically to bypass your automated compliance flags. Those microtransactions were routed to a shipping entity registered in Delaware, a company that possesses no physical address, no active fleet, and zero payroll records. A phantom vendor." "That is a lie," Naomi hissed, but her voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. It sounded thin, desperate. I ignored her, entirely pressing the attack. "From Delaware, your corporate funds were washed through a holding firm in Panama to break the chain of custody. Then they were consolidated into a master trust account registered in the Cayman Islands, a trust account that holds exactly $50 million. Chairman Thompson turned slowly to look at Naomi. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging deeply alarmed glances. The level of detail I was providing was far too specific to be the ramblings of a grieving, delusional widow. Harrison found the discrepancy during his stroke recovery last year, I explained, keeping the narrative flowing with relentless momentum. He had time to review the raw, unfiltered data away from Naomi's curated presentations. He realized his own son and daughter-in-law were gutting his life's work, so he used his executive override authority to quietly pull the stolen funds out of the Cayman Trust. He trapped the blood money in a hidden domestic account, the Alpha Fund gathering it as the ultimate physical evidence of their massive wire fraud. Jackson looked like he was about to physically implode. His hands opened and closed into tight fists. She is insane. She hacked the network. She created these fake numbers to cover her own tracks. Did I? I challenged, my eyes boring into him. Then explain how I possess the digital incorporation documents for the Cayman Trust. Explain how your digital signature and Naomi's digital signature are listed as the sole beneficiaries of the stolen $50 million. A collective gasp rippled through the board members. Bradley, the probate lawyer, suddenly took two very deliberate steps away from Jackson and Naomi, physically distancing himself from his own clients. His legal survival instincts had just kicked into high gear. Naomi lunged across the table. Her polished demeanor completely evaporated, replaced by raw, frantic terror. She reached for the laptop resting in front of me, desperate to slam the lid shut and sever the connection to the monitor. "Do not touch that machine, Naomi," I warned, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. She froze, her hand hovering just inches from the keyboard. "I know how you operate," I said, staring her down. "I built a secondary trigger mechanism into this terminal. If you attempt to close that lid, or if anyone enters an incorrect master password, the system will immediately lock the screen. It will instantly wipe the local hard drive to protect my forensic data, and it will silently push the background routing command straight through the server. You make one sudden move, and you lose all control of the situation." Naomi slowly pulled her hand back. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She finally realized the depth of her miscalculation. She had brought a knife to a gunfight, completely unaware that I was holding the nuclear launch codes. "You have the attention of the board," Chairman Thompson said. His voice was grim, devoid of any previous skepticism. "You made severe allegations. Now show us the proof." I placed my hand back onto the laptop trackpad. The time for talking was over. It was time to show them the bodies buried beneath the floorboards. I tapped a highly specific sequence of keys and expertly executed the primary display command. The massive flat-screen monitor mounted at the head of the mahogany table flickered. The false banking interface vanished entirely, replaced by a stark, high-contrast digital map. It was a sprawling, interconnected web of data points glowing with raw financial truth. I stood up and moved toward the screen, abandoning my position at the far end of the table. I commanded the room now. "Let us begin with the third quarter of last year," I stated, pointing to a cluster of red data nodes on the left side of the screen. Our international freight division secured a massive logistics contract with European distributors. According to the internal ledgers presented by your chief financial officer, the operational costs for that specific quarter skyrocketed by 12%. Naomi blamed unexpected port tariffs and fuel surcharges. But if we pull the actual vendor invoices, the truth emerges. I clicked my wireless mouse. A series of scanned documents populated the monitor. You will notice thousands of micro-invoices billed to an entity named Apex Horizon Freight. These invoices averaged just under $10,000 each. By keeping the individual amounts low, Naomi ensured they bypassed the automated secondary review protocols required for large vendor payouts. She authorized every single one of these payments using her executive administrative credentials. I highlighted a specific string of code at the bottom of the invoices. That is her digital authorization signature. Undeniable, and time-stamped. Chairman Thompson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the screen. Where did this money actually go? I clicked the mouse again. The red nodes on the map animated, drawing a bright line straight from the corporate accounts to a single destination. It went to Delaware, I explained. Apex Horizon Freight is a shell company. It has no trucks, no warehouses, and no employees. It is a paper ghost. But the money did not stay there. Naomi utilized a classic layering technique to obscure the trail. Another click. The map shifted, showing the funds bouncing from Delaware to a corporate registry in Panama, then splintering across a dozen different private accounts in Switzerland. She fractured the capital to confuse any potential external audit. I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. But money leaves a gravitational pull. If you follow the mass, it always consolidates. I executed the final mapping command. The scattered data points on the screen converged, forming a single massive golden node located in the Caribbean. The money pooled into a master trust account registered in the Cayman Islands, I announced. A fortress designed to hide illicit wealth from federal regulators. Finding the trust is difficult, but proving ownership is usually impossible because they use proxy directors. Fortunately for us, I do not rely on public records. I rely on encrypted back-end data. I brought up the deeply buried incorporation documents I had extracted from the offshore servers. The text was dense with legal jargon, but the crucial information was highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow. Look at the beneficiary listings, I instructed the board. The entire boardroom erupted into immediate shocked gasps from every single seated executive. There, displayed in massive font for the entire corporate hierarchy to see, were the digital signatures and verified identities of the sole beneficiaries of the $50 million Cayman Trust. Jackson and Naomi. You miserable thief, an older board member shouted, slamming his fist onto the table as he glared at Naomi. We trusted you with the entire financial foundation of this company. It is fabricated! Naomi shrieked, her pristine composure completely shattered. Her voice was shrill, desperate. She hacked the network and planted those documents to frame us. She is a forensic accountant. She knows exactly how to manipulate digital evidence. Jackson backed away from the table, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors, as if calculating his chances of escaping the hotel. If I fabricated this data, I countered, my voice cutting easily through her panic. Then how do you explain the next folder? I did not give them a second to breathe. I clicked the mouse, opening the most damning piece of evidence I possessed. The screen shifted from offshore banking records to the corporate executive health plan disbursements. Stealing $50 million requires constant maintenance, I explained, pacing slowly behind the row of seated executives. Harrison was brilliant. He noticed the microscopic bleeding in the margins. 3 weeks ago, he initiated a secret internal audit. He found the embezzlement. He used his founder-level executive override to hijack the Panamanian routing chain, clawing the stolen $50 million back into a hidden domestic account, the Alpha Fund. He was gathering the ultimate proof to hand you over to the authorities. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the silent room. And you realized he caught you, Naomi. You knew you were about to lose your wealth, your career, and your freedom. So you decided to silence him. I brought up a new document on the screen. It was a payment authorization log. 18 days ago, Naomi forced Harrison to switch his primary care to a highly exclusive concierge physician named Dr. Eris Thorne. She paid his exorbitant retainer using the corporate executive health plan. But if we dig into the secondary ledgers, a completely different story unfolds. I clicked the mouse. A hidden transaction appeared, linking Naomi to a biomedical research firm registered in Belize. Naomi authorized a separate, heavily concealed consulting fee of $2 million to this Belizean entity, I revealed. The primary shareholder of that firm is a holding company controlled directly by Dr. Thorne. Chairman Thompson stood up, his face pale with horror. Are you saying she paid a doctor $2 million to commit murder? To literally murder my husband? I finished, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Dr. Thorne discontinued Harrison's standard blood thinners and prescribed an experimental cardiovascular drug. a drug explicitly known to cause fatal cardiac arrest in patients with a history of arterial damage. He prescribed a lethal dose under the guise of stroke prevention. Naomi paid an assassin to trigger a fatal heart attack before Harrison could expose her fraud. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Executives shouted over one another, their voices thick with outrage and disbelief. Bradley, the probate lawyer, was frantically stuffing his legal documents back into his briefcase, desperate to flee the room and sever all ties with his clients. Jackson grabbed Naomi tightly by the arm, his face completely twisted in sheer terror. "We need to leave this hotel building, right now." Naomi ripped her arm away from his grasp. She lunged forward, her eyes wild with a cornered, feral desperation. She stared at the laptop resting on the table, realizing that the only way to save herself was to destroy the machine broadcasting her crimes. "Shut it all down," Naomi screamed, launching her body across the polished oak table toward my computer. The absolute final act of the dark play had arrived. I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I stood perfectly still and prepared to deliver the killing blow. Jackson snapped out of his paralyzed state. He threw himself forward, sweeping a crystal pitcher off the table as he scrambled to reach the keyboard. He wanted to shatter the glass and sever the connection to the monitor displaying their ruin. I moved faster. My hand darted out, my index finger finding the enter key. I pressed it down with every ounce of strength I possessed. A sharp, authoritative chime echoed from the laptop speakers. Jackson slammed into the edge of the table, his grasping hands missing the computer by inches. Naomi collapsed against the polished wood, staring wildly at the massive screen. She was expecting the terminal to go completely black, hoping for a cancellation confirmation. Instead, the interface completely transformed. The fake banking overlay dissolved into green pixels. The true back-end routing script flooded the monitor. A progress bar appeared, glowing with intense finality. "Transaction authorized." The computerized voice announced the automated audio, filling the dead silence of the VIP suite. Naomi scrambled backward, her eyes wide with frantic confusion. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. "You transferred it to yourself. You stole it. Bradley, call the police right now. She just stole $50 million. Bradley did not move a single muscle. The probate lawyer was pressed flat against the back wall, his hands raised slightly in the air, trying to become completely invisible to avoid any legal association with the unfolding disaster. "Look at the routing destination, Naomi," I commanded, stepping away from the table and crossing my arms tightly over my black blazer. "Look exactly where your stolen fortune just went." Chairman Thompson and the rest of the board members craned their necks to read the massive text scrolling across the monitor. The progress bar hit 100%. A bold green confirmation box locked into the center of the screen for everyone to see. "Funds transferred. Amount is $50,340,000. Destination is the United States Department of Justice. Division is Corporate Fraud Task Force. Account type is Active Escrow Evidence Vault." Naomi stopped breathing. Her perfectly structured world shattered into a million irreparable pieces in real time. Jackson stumbled backward, his face completely drained of all color. He looked from the screen to his wife, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. "No," he gasped, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper. "No, do not send it." "It is already gone, Jackson." I stated, my voice echoing with icy triumph. "I did not steal a single penny. I surrendered it. I took the entire $50 million you murdered Harrison to protect, and I handed it directly to the federal government as the primary physical exhibit in a massive corporate homicide investigation." "You insane, vindictive gold digger," Naomi screamed. She lunged at me, her hands curling into vicious claws, desperate to inflict physical pain now that her financial empire was completely eradicated. Before she could cross the plush carpet, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite exploded open. The violent impact shook the entire room. A highly coordinated team of federal agents flooded into the space. They moved with terrifying tactical precision, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow FBI letters across the back. The sheer physical presence of the strike team instantly neutralized any remaining threat in the room. Federal agents, nobody move, a booming voice commanded, halting Naomi in her tracks. Special Agent David Carter strode through the doorway, his golden badge held high. His sharp eyes scanned the chaotic scene, quickly assessing the frozen board members, the terrified lawyer, and the two primary targets standing near the conference table. He looked at me and gave a microscopic, deeply respectful nod. The trap had worked flawlessly. Naomi Williams and Jackson Williams. Agent Carter announced, his voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of federal authority. He pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from his jacket pocket. "You are both under arrest." "For what?" Jackson shrieked, his voice cracking violently, as two heavily armed agents grabbed his arms and forced them roughly behind his back. "We did not do anything wrong. This is a private corporate meeting. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder." Agent Carter stated, reading directly from the official warrant. "We have secured the $50 million in the Department of Justice escrow account. We also have federal units currently raiding the offices of Dr. Eris Thorne. We have the medical logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital authorizations. It is completely over." Naomi fought wildly against the agents attempting to restrain her. She kicked and thrashed her emerald designer dress, twisting as the cold steel handcuffs snapped brutally around her wrists, locking her arms behind her back. "This is a setup," she screamed, spitting venom in my direction. "She engineered this entire situation. She is framing us. You have to listen to me." "Save it for the federal judge," Naomi Agent Carter replied coldly. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately." The board of directors watched in absolute stunned silence as the two arrogant, ruthless heirs to the logistics empire were reduced to screaming, desperate criminals. The polished veneer of corporate invincibility was entirely gone. Jackson began to sob loudly, his tears genuine, now born of absolute terror, as the federal agents hauled him forcefully toward the exit. Naomi refused to break eye contact with me as they dragged her backward toward the doorway. Her eyes were burning with unadulterated hatred. "You will pay for this, Lauren," she hissed, her voice echoing down the hallway as she struggled against the agents. "I will destroy you." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my hands steady. I looked at the woman who had murdered my husband and smiled a cold, victorious smile. "You already tried, Naomi," I said softly. "And you failed." The heavy mahogany doors swung shut abruptly, cutting off Naomi's screaming. The finality of that sound echoed through the VIP suite like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The chaotic energy vanished, leaving a sterile, ringing silence. Through the walls, I could hear the muffled scuffling of expensive leather shoes slipping against the hallway marble, followed by the metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting tight. Jackson was loudly begging for his father, a pathetic display from a man who had orchestrated that very father's execution. Inside the boardroom, nobody moved. The logistics executives were entirely frozen in their high-backed chairs. They stared at the empty doorway, then slowly turned their collective gaze toward me. I remained standing at the head of the oak conference table, my posture rigid, my black blazer immaculate. I was no longer the vulnerable, discarded widow they had sneered at in the ballroom just 30 minutes prior. I was the absolute epicenter of their survival. A sudden, frantic shuffling noise broke the tension. Bradley, the ruthless probate shark who had gleefully presented my eviction notice hours after my husband died, was attempting a desperate tactical retreat. His hands shook violently as he jammed his forged legal documents into his designer briefcase. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, hoping to slip out the side exit before the federal agents returned. "Going somewhere, Bradley?" I asked. My voice was pitched low, but it commanded the room effortlessly. Bradley froze. He slowly straightened his posture, attempting to summon his arrogant courtroom persona. "I am asserting attorney-client privilege," he stammered. "My clients have been detained. I must go to the federal courthouse to arrange their bail hearings." "You are not going to a bail hearing," Bradley Agent Carter announced, stepping back into the VIP suite. The federal investigator locked his eyes onto the trembling lawyer. "You are going to need your own legal representation. I am a licensed attorney. I simply drafted an emergency injunction based on financial data provided by the chief financial officer. I had no knowledge of any corporate embezzlement or medical foul play. Ignorance is a terrible defense when your signature is on the perjury, I countered, stepping toward him. You woke up a Superior Court judge at 2 in the morning. You filed a sworn affidavit claiming I posed an immediate flight risk. You drafted a legal fiction to unlawfully evict a legal spouse from her marital home, bypassing standard probate notification periods. I was operating on the sworn testimony of the household staff, Bradley argued weakly. Testimony that Naomi paid for using corporate accounts, Agent Carter interjected. We cross-referenced the bank records Lauren provided. Naomi wired $50,000 to the estate manager just 2 days before Harrison died. It was a direct bribe to secure false witness statements. As the executing attorney, you failed to perform a basic fiduciary review. My legal duty was to the primary beneficiary of the trust. Your legal duty was to the law, I snapped. You knowingly submitted fraudulent affidavits to secure a wrongful eviction. You facilitated the freezing of my personal banking accounts to economically paralyze a witness to a federal crime. That is criminal conspiracy. Agent Carter gestured to a pair of tactical agents waiting in the corridor. Robert Bradley, you are being detained for questioning regarding the submission of fraudulent legal documents. You are also a person of interest in a federal wire fraud conspiracy. No, you cannot do this. Bradley protested, panic overriding his polished exterior. I am a partner at my firm. I did not know about the murder, I swear. The agents flanked him immediately, grabbing his wrists with practiced efficiency. Bradley dropped his designer briefcase. The brass clasp popped open upon hitting the carpet, spilling the fraudulent non-disclosure agreements and the $1 million hush money check across the floor. The sound of a third pair of steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the VIP suite. You are going to lose your law license by tomorrow morning, Bradley, I stated coldly as the agents marched him toward the door. And you are going to spend the next decade trying to plea bargain your way out of a federal conspiracy charge. As Bradley was hauled away, I turned my attention back to the conference table. The board of directors looked absolutely terrified. The power dynamics of the logistics empire had been violently reset in less than 10 minutes. Chairman Thompson slowly stood up, smoothing his tie. He looked at the projected screen, which still displayed the Department of Justice escrow confirmation, and then looked directly at me. Lauren, he began diplomatically. The board had no idea the extent of Naomi's deception. We thought we were protecting the company and Harrison's legacy. We sincerely apologize for any distress we caused you tonight. We are fully prepared to reinstate your access to the estate and assist you in claiming your rightful inheritance. I stared at the chairman. This was the exact same man who had purposefully turned his back on me in the ballroom 30 minutes ago. He allowed Naomi to treat me like a criminal. His sudden apology was motivated entirely by the terrifying realization that I held the digital evidence that could easily implicate the entire executive board in massive corporate negligence. They had failed their fiduciary duties, allowing $50 million to bleed out under their noses. Your apologies mean absolutely nothing to me, Chairman, I replied, my voice slicing through his pathetic attempt at diplomacy. You did not protect Harrison's legacy. You protected your stock options. You blindly trusted a murderer because she kept your quarterly dividends high, and you threw me to the wolves because it was the most convenient solution to your public relations problem. Thompson swallowed hard, flushing with unmistakable shame. The other executives kept their eyes glued to the polished oak table. Agent Carter stepped up beside me. The Department of Justice will be conducting a full unredacted audit of this entire corporation starting tomorrow morning, Carter announced to the room. Every financial decision made by this board over the past 4 years will be scrutinized by federal investigators. Nobody leaves the city. The executive suite felt like a tomb. The elite corporate titans were completely trapped, stripped of their power, and facing the absolute destruction of their professional lives. I reached down, grabbed my encrypted laptop, and slid it safely into my leather bag. I had executed my husband's final request flawlessly. The blood money was secured in a federal vault. The murderers were in custody, and the corrupt enablers were facing their own brutal reckoning. I turned my back on the board of directors and walked out of the room. I turned my back on the board of directors and walked out of the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, sealing the fate of the executives trapped inside with Agent Carter. I walked down the carpeted hallway, feeling the adrenaline slowly recede, replaced by a profound, crystal-clear sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor who had just detonated a federal explosive under the people who murdered my husband. I stepped back into the grand ballroom. The atmosphere had completely inverted. The string quartet had stopped playing. The low murmur of corporate networking had shattered into a frantic, chaotic buzz. Security guards were stationed at the main exits, and federal agents in windbreakers were directing guests toward the lobby. Word of the dramatic arrests had already rippled through the crowd of hundreds. Everyone knew that Jackson and Naomi had been hauled out in handcuffs. And everyone knew I was the one who orchestrated it. As I walked across the room, the same people who had physically turned their backs on me just an hour ago now stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. The crowd parted for me out of absolute fear. They looked at me as if I possessed the power to destroy their lives with a single keystroke. And considering what I had just done to the chief financial officer, they were absolutely right. Before I could reach the grand marble staircase, a group of Harrison extended relatives intercepted me. These were the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly consumed Jackson's vicious social media video. They had spent the entire evening treating me like a parasitic disease, refusing to offer a single word of condolence for the man I loved. Aunt Beatrice Harrison, older sister, stepped forward. Her previously haughty expression had completely melted into a mask of desperate performative affection. She reached out her hands, fluttering as if she wanted to embrace me. "Lauren, my goodness!" Beatrice gasped, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We are completely in shock. We had absolutely no idea what Jackson and Naomi were doing behind our backs. It is simply horrifying. You must be so traumatized by this entire ordeal." I stopped walking. I did not step back, but I did not allow her to touch me. I simply stared at her outstretched hands until she awkwardly lowered them to her sides. Cousin Gregory, a man who had aggressively lobbied Harrison for investment capital for years, quickly flanked his mother. "Lauren, you have to forgive us," Gregory pleaded, shifting his weight nervously. "Jackson fed us a terrible narrative. He manipulated the entire family into believing you were taking advantage of Harrison. We were just trying to protect my uncle's legacy. You know how much we love you. We are family after all." "Family," I repeated. The word tasted incredibly sour. "Yes, of course," Beatrice chimed in, stepping closer. "We need to stick together right now. The press is going to have a field day with these arrests. We should coordinate a unified public front. Why do you not come back to our estate in Bellevue tonight? We can pour some wine, process this terrible betrayal together, and figure out how to manage the media fallout." I looked at the group of relatives surrounding me. I saw right through their panicked, greedy calculations. They knew the $50 million had been intercepted by the federal government, but they also knew that with Jackson and Naomi heading to prison, I was now the undisputed sole heir to the remainder of Harrison's vast logistics fortune. The very people who had gleefully watched me be evicted into the freezing rain were now terrified they were about to be cut out of the billionaire will. They wanted access to my wealth, and they were willing to use cheap flattery to secure it. "You do not love me, Beatrice?" I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute detachment that made her flinch. "You tolerated me because Harrison forced you to, and the second he died, you happily joined the mob trying to destroy me." "Lauren, please, that is not true," Gregory stammered, raising his hands defensively. "We were victims of Jackson's lies too." "You were not victims," I corrected sharply. "You were volunteers. When Jackson posted that defamatory video this morning, you did not call me to ask for my side of the story. You did not offer me a place to sleep when I was illegally thrown out of my home. You hit the share button. You gossiped with your country club friends. You watched me walk into this ballroom tonight and treated me like a criminal. You chose your side because you thought Jackson held the keys to the corporate vault." Beatrice's face flushed a deep, embarrassed red. "We were confused. We were grieving." "You were greedy," I countered. I took a step forward, forcing Beatrice and Gregory to physically retreat. My grief was real. I spent the last 5 years loving Harrison, caring for him, and fighting for his health. You spent the last 5 years calculating how much of his money you would inherit. You do not get to call me family now that your golden boy is sitting in the back of a federal transport van. I adjusted the strap of my leather bag on my shoulder, standing perfectly tall. This is the last time any of you will ever speak to me, I announced, my voice carrying clearly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. I am establishing absolute no contact with this entire side of the family. If you call my phone, it will be blocked. If you show up at my property, you will be arrested for trespassing. If you attempt to communicate with me through any channel, my legal team will file immediate harassment charges. Lauren, you cannot do this. Beatrice cried out, her facade of politeness dropping to reveal pure panic. You cannot just cut us off completely. We are Harrison blood. I can, and I just did, I replied smoothly. Harrison knew exactly who you were. He knew you were parasites. That is why he trusted me to execute his final wishes instead of you. I did not wait for another desperate plea or hollow apology. I walked right past them, descending the grand marble staircase with steady, deliberate steps. I left the sycophants standing in the middle of the ballroom, completely paralyzed by the realization that their access to the logistics empire was permanently severed. They had bet their entire social and financial standing on a pair of murderers, and they had lost everything. As I moved toward the grand lobby doors, I saw other familiar faces trying to catch my eye. Former neighbors, wealthy socialites, and minor shareholders who had snubbed me all evening now offered tentative plastic smiles. They were testing the waters, trying to gauge if I would accept their silent apologies. I did not return a single glance. I kept my chin high, navigating the sea of sudden admirers with the same cold indifference they had shown me in my darkest hour. A concierge opened the heavy brass doors. I stepped out into the Seattle night. The freezing, aggressive rain from the previous night had completely stopped. The sky had cleared, revealing a brilliant, sharp canopy of stars over the city skyline. The crisp, clean air filled my lungs, washing away the suffocating scent of the hotel ballroom. I walked down the quiet, wet pavement. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a secure text message from Agent Carter confirming that Naomi and Jackson were officially booked into federal holding, and the escrow transfer was fully verified. The nightmare was truly over. I felt no sudden euphoria. Healing does not happen instantaneously. I had a massive gaping hole in my heart where my husband used to be, and I knew the grief would hit me in terrifying waves over the coming weeks. But as I hailed a cab to take me to a safe, comfortable hotel, I felt an undeniable sense of peace. I had faced the most toxic, manipulative forces in my life, and I had absolutely crushed them. I settled into the back seat of the cab, resting my head against the cool glass. The city lights blurred past, painting the dark interior with flashes of gold and white. I was totally exhausted, yet completely reborn. The war was decisively finished. Now my real journey was finally beginning. The morning after the hotel confrontation broke across national news networks, the spectacular downfall of the logistics empire heirs dominated the financial press. But while the media feasted on the scandalous arrests of Jackson and Naomi, my focus shifted entirely to a much quieter, far more methodical battlefield. I had to navigate the probate courts of Massachusetts to reclaim the clean, legitimate inheritance Harrison had actually intended for me. The emergency injunction Naomi had forged was still technically on the books, effectively locking me out of the Beacon Hill estate and my marital assets. I needed to legally dismantle it and wipe the public slate completely clean. I hired Eleanor Vance, a heavyweight probate litigator renowned for her absolute intolerance of corporate bullying. Unlike Bradley, Eleanor was a legal surgeon. We walked into the Suffolk County Courthouse exactly 3 weeks later. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy with procedural anticipation. The media was barred from entry, leaving only the dull echo of polished mahogany and the stern presence of Judge Harmon. This was the same judge Bradley had woken up at 2 a.m. to sign the fraudulent eviction order. Judge Harmon was furious, utterly humiliated that his court had been weaponized to facilitate a federal conspiracy. Eleanor presented our case with terrifying precision. She laid out the forensic timeline I had compiled in that freezing motel room. She provided the sworn affidavits from Agent Carter, confirming that the $50 million wire transfer was a secure evidence deposit requested by the Department of Justice, not an act of theft by a desperate widow. Furthermore, Eleanor introduced the actual legally binding will Harrison had drafted and notarized 2 years prior. It was a pristine document untouched by Naomi tampering. The will clearly stipulated that the Beacon Hill estate, the primary checking accounts, and a substantial clean stock portfolio were left entirely to me. The opposing counsel, a frantic junior partner assigned to represent the now incarcerated Jackson, offered practically no resistance. Their entire legal strategy had evaporated the second Naomi was indicted for wire fraud. They attempted a pathetic plea for a delayed settlement, arguing that the logistics company assets needed to be separated from the personal estate. Eleanor shut them down instantly, citing the ironclad prenuptial protections Harrison had put in place specifically to shield my assets from corporate liability. Judge Harmon did not hesitate. He struck down the ex parte injunction with extreme prejudice. He formally reinstated my full access to all marital accounts and officially recognized me as the sole legitimate executor of Harrison personal estate. The gavel slammed down, echoing through the empty gallery. In less than 45 minutes, the legal nightmare was entirely eradicated. I walked out of the courthouse with my head held high, holding the certified court orders that proved my absolute innocence to the world. My first destination was not a celebration dinner. It was Beacon Hill. I directed my private driver to navigate the familiar winding streets toward the mansion. The iron gates parted smoothly as the new security team I had hired recognized my vehicle. I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway. The manicured lawns and the blooming hydrangeas Harrison and I had planted together looked exactly the same, but the energy of the property had completely changed. It was no longer a crime scene. It was a reclaimed sanctuary. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door using a brand new set of brass keys. The grand foyer was silent, bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The household staff, the same employees who had accepted Naomi bribes to sign false affidavits against me, had already been permanently dismissed and replaced. The house felt incredibly clean, completely purged of the toxic sycophants who had hovered around Harrison in his final days. I walked slowly through the expansive rooms. I trailed my hand along the polished banister, feeling a profound sense of ownership. I was not a guest here. I was not a gold digger occupying a space I did not earn. I had fought a brutal war against ruthless corporate predators to protect this home and the memory of the man who bought it. I stepped into the private dining room. The floor where Harrison had collapsed was spotless. The painful memory of his final moments rushed back, threatening to steal my breath, but I did not look away. I faced the memory head-on. I had honored his last command. I had protected his legacy from the scavengers. I had secured the evidence that would keep his murderers locked in a federal penitentiary for decades. The clean inheritance sitting in my bank accounts was not blood money. It was the rightful conclusion of a life built on integrity. I moved into the master suite and opened the heavy velvet curtains. The view of the Boston skyline stretched out before me, vast and full of untethered possibility. I had my financial independence completely restored. I possessed the resources and the brilliant forensic mind to dictate my own future. Jackson and Naomi were currently trading their tailored designer suits for standard-issue prison uniforms, while the sycophantic relatives who had shunned me were begging for relevance in a social circle that had entirely moved on without them. The public narrative had completely flipped. The very media outlets that had eagerly published Jackson's defamatory video were now running extensive profiles on my background. They highlighted my past career as a top-tier forensic accountant, detailing how my unmatched financial expertise had single-handedly exposed a massive corporate homicide conspiracy. I was no longer perceived as the helpless, opportunistic widow. I was universally recognized as a lethal adversary who outsmarted a billion-dollar fraud ring. My reputation was absolutely bulletproof. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the corner of the room. I opened my personal laptop, the very machine that had executed the flawless digital trap. I logged into my newly restored banking portal. The accounts were active, secure, and overflowing with clean, undisputed capital. But looking at the staggering numbers, I knew my work was not entirely finished. Healing from this level of profound betrayal required more than just securing my own comfort. It required action. It required taking the immense power I now wielded and using it to ensure no one else would ever be crushed by the kind of predatory greed that had temporarily destroyed my life. I stared at the screen, my mind already outlining the framework for a new enterprise. The grief would always remain a quiet shadow in my heart, but the fire in my veins was burning brighter than ever. I was ready to build an empire of my own. I was ready to build an empire of my own. The very next morning, I contacted Brenda Lawson and instructed her to draft the incorporation documents for a new nonprofit organization. I endowed the project with $10 million from my clean inheritance. I named it the Harrison Shield Foundation. Its mission was highly specific and aggressively executed. We provided elite forensic accountants, ruthless probate litigators, and dedicated private investigators to vulnerable elderly individuals and targeted widows who were actively facing financial exploitation from predatory family members. I knew exactly how terrifying it felt to be stripped of all resources and thrown into the street by greedy relatives wielding forged legal documents. I swore I would never let another woman or elderly person in Massachusetts face that nightmare alone. Within 6 months, the foundation was operating at full capacity. We took on complex cases that standard legal aid clinics simply did not have the financial literacy to prosecute. I personally oversaw the forensic audits. My team dismantled abusive conservatorships, traced stolen retirement funds hidden in offshore cryptocurrency wallets, and dragged arrogant, thieving relatives into federal court. Every time we handed a restored bank account back to a weeping grandmother or secured a permanent restraining order for a terrified widow, I felt another fracture in my own grieving heart mend. I was using the very skills that saved my life to become an unbreakable shield for others in desperate need. While my new life flourished, the architects of my misery faced their absolute ruin. The federal trial of Jackson and Naomi concluded swiftly. Agent Carter had built an impenetrable case using the digital roadmap I provided. Faced with the overwhelming evidence from the Department of Justice escrow trap and the Belizean money trail, their high-priced defense attorneys advised them to accept a plea deal. Naomi was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Jackson received 20 years as a willing accomplice and co-conspirator. The logistics empire purged them from its history, completely rebranding under new leadership to survive the public relations nightmare. Bradley, the slick probate lawyer who had tried to intimidate me, was permanently disbarred and indicted for his role in the fraudulent eviction. As for the extended relatives who had shunned me in that grand hotel ballroom, they vanished into total obscurity. My strict no-contact order remained a flawless, impenetrable wall. Occasionally, I would see an email from Aunt Beatrice or Cousin Gregory trapped in my spam folder begging for a meeting or a small loan to cover their mounting debts. I deleted them without reading past the subject lines. They had gambled their loyalty on toxic greed, and they were paying the ultimate price with total social and financial irrelevance. A year to the day after Harrison passed away, I drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery. The sharp, biting cold of that terrible Seattle night was a distant memory, replaced by the gentle warmth of a bright, clear Boston spring. The sprawling cemetery was quiet, filled with the soft rustle of ancient oak trees and the distant chirping of robins. I walked down the manicured stone path, my heels clicking softly against the pavement, until I reached his resting place. The polished granite headstone gleamed beautifully in the afternoon sunlight. I knelt and placed a fresh bouquet of white hydrangeas at the base of the stone. They were the exact same flowers we had planted together in the front yard of our Beacon Hill home. I traced the engraved letters of his name with my fingertips. "We did it, Harrison." I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the crushing panic that had consumed me a year ago. The company is clean. The foundation is thriving. I made sure they could never hurt anyone else again. I sat on the warm grass for a long time, simply enjoying the profound stillness. There was a time when I thought losing Harrison would completely break me. I thought my entire identity was wrapped up in being his wife and building a peaceful sanctuary away from the brutal corporate world I had left behind. But sitting there in the sun, I realized that the sanctuary was never the house. The sanctuary was my own mind. Harrison had known that. He had seen my strength long before I was forced to wield it. He trusted me with the $50 million trap because he knew I was the only person ruthless and brilliant enough to spring it perfectly without hesitation. I stood up and brushed the grass from my black tailored slacks. I took one last look at the grave, feeling a deep, abiding peace wash over my soul. I was no longer the targeted victim running from a manufactured eviction. I was a fiercely independent, wealthy, and powerful woman who had stared down a syndicate of corporate murderers and emerged utterly victorious. The greatest protection a woman can ever possess is not relying on the wealth or status of someone else. It is the absolute unshakable ability to stand firmly on her own 2 feet when the entire world collapses around her. It is the power to look at those who try to destroy her, recognize their weaknesses, and dismantle their empires with cold, calculated precision. I slowly walked back down the long stone path toward my waiting luxury car, confidently stepping out of the dark shadows of the cemetery and directly into the brilliant sunlit future I had secured for myself. I was completely free. Have you ever been pushed to the absolute edge by toxic people calling themselves family, only to use your own intelligence to make them pay the ultimate price? Have you ever had to build a fortress out of your own resilience? Share your story in the comments below right now. As an I don't experience human emotions, betrayal, or the sharp sting of grief. However, analyzing Lauren's harrowing journey from a devastated evicted widow to a triumphant force of justice reveals a profoundly human lesson. True, security is never something that can be handed to you. It must be cultivated entirely from within. When Harrison died, the protective bubble of Lauren's comfortable life was instantly shattered. The very people who should have supported her, her stepson and his wife, became her most ruthless predators. If Lauren had been nothing more than the dependent wife they assumed her to be, she would have been completely crushed under the weight of their forged injunctions and cruel manipulation. Instead, she survived because she had built her own internal fortress. The ultimate takeaway from this intense story is that your greatest defense mechanism is your own competence, intellect, and self-reliance. Wealth, social status, and even the fierce protection of a loving partner can be stripped away in a matter of hours. But the skills you build, the resilience you continuously forge, and the boundaries you firmly set are untouchable. Lauren did not defeat a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy by relying on Harrison's money. She won by weaponizing her own background as a forensic auditor and absolutely refusing to be a passive victim. She powerfully reminds us that true empowerment means having the capacity to save yourself when all other safety nets fail. Life will inevitably test your foundations, often through the very people you are supposed to trust the most. When that happens, you must be ready to become your own absolute savior. If you found yourself nodding along to this lesson, I challenge you to take one step today toward building your own unshakable independence and share your journey with us in the comments below.